Psychology in Inclusivity. Thus, we will listen to three experts, which are Dr. Danene, who already joined with us right now in the Zoom meeting. And then we will have Marveggio from Adelaide University. And last but not least, Dr. Subban from Monash University. Okay, before we start, we will listen opening remarks from the head of psychology department. For Bapak Ali Masuri, SPSI MSc PhD, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Yuli. Hello, everyone. I hope you are all doing well today. The Department of Psychology proudly presents a two-day seminars featuring the topic on inclusivity management, challenges and opportunities in implementing inclusive psychology. We have invited esteemed guest lecturers from reputable international universities. The first guest lecturer is Dr. Danene. She is an associate professor from Department of Teaching and Learning, the Ohio State University. And the second is Marveggio. He is researcher from the School of Psychology, University of Adelaide. And the third is Dr. Pearl Subban. She is an associate professor from School of Curriculum, Teaching and Inclusive Education, Monash University. How are you, Dr. Danene? Can you hear
I
my
am.
voice?
I can hear you. Can you hear my
Okay.
voice?
Yeah. What time is it in US?
It is 9:20 p.m.
Oh,
on
we
November.
have a really significant gaps.
Yep,
Thank
November
you, Dr.
5th.
Danene. Yeah.
So
Thank you very
I'm
much
in the
for your
past. You're in the
generous,
future.
yeah, for your generosity to have lecture today. Thank you very much. And I think the topics today is really fits well with the vision of our university, University of Brawijaya, because our university, have a vision to create a disability free, friendly environment and to promote inclusive society in Indonesia. And the topic today perhaps a focus on the meso context of inclusivity. We're gonna learn about how inclusivity can be applied within two contexts. The first one is educational, and the second one will be organizational. So once again, I think the topic will, give us a very benefits in getting a better understanding about how inclusivity can be applied within the two settings, educational and organizational. For this event, I would also like to thank my colleagues, Mbak Yuli, Sukma, who have organized this events long ago, I think. And also I thank to the audience, the undergraduates psychology programs, University of Brawijaya. Thank you very much for your attendance. I hope that you will be very enthusiastic in joining this seminar. I think that is the end of my opening remarks. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you for the opening remarks from Pak Ali. So, guys, we will now start the lecture from Dr. Danin. Before she present her materials, I will read her curriculum vitae first. So we have a very distinguished expertise, yeah. She has a very distinguished expertise, Dr. Danin. She hold a Bachelor of Science in Education from Kutztown University of Pennsylvania, and then her Master of Arts from Western Michigan University, and her PhD from Ohio State University. And right now she is a faculty lead for the Ohio State University programs in visual impairment. Before we start, guys, so Dr. Danene will has materials contains educational service for individuals with special needs, specifically maybe in individuals with visual impairments. And then we will learn a lot from her to how to overcome the limitation of teachers in the field of visual impairment to increase accessibility to educational services. Okay, Danene, are you ready to present your materials?
I am ready. Thank you for that kind introduction.
Okay, so you can start right now, please.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, or good evening from Ohio, everyone, and good morning to Indonesia. In preparing for tonight's presentation, I was joking that I'm speaking from the past to the future. And for those of you who don't know, it is election day in the United States. So I jokingly said, maybe you know the results of our election because you are in the future. But I know that that's not true, but I thought that would be a fun way just to kind of start today's presentation. For today's presentation, as you can see here on the slide, I'm going to be talking about seeing beyond barriers and fostering inclusion for students with visual impairments. So in looking at today's presentation, an overview of the materials that we are going to cover include it is designed as an informational session tailored for psychology professionals interested in inclusivity for students with visual impairments. It will address the history of inclusive practices within the United States, as well as laws that support accessibility for students with vision loss in our country. It'll have a discussion about challenges associated with teaching content to students with vision loss, and will be incorporated with an exploration of misconceptions that often come with working with students who have visual impairments. And then finally, we will conclude with information about working with students who have visual impairments with an aim to provide a comprehensive understanding of the fundamentals, the roles, and pedagogical practices that are essential for effectively working with visually impaired students using collaborative practices. So we'll begin just with a short overview. So I'm a teacher by trade. I'm a teacher by nature. I always like to know what's coming next. So I always like to start my presentations with a brief overview so that you know what to expect as part of the presentation. So for today's presentation, we'll start with what is accessibility and talk a little bit about how accessibility leads to inclusion. We will then move to a brief history of inclusion in the United States. We'll talk a bit about educational laws that support inclusion. And then we'll move into some more specifics about visual impairments, including unique learning needs of students with visual impairments, collaborations that are important among professionals, things you can do in the field of psychology to work with educational professionals who serve students who have visual impairments. And then we'll wrap up talking about building community and fostering inclusive practices within your own professional fields.
Sorry, Danene, we cannot see your presentation right now.
Oh, hold on.
Yeah.
Let's make sure that that works. How's that?
Yes. We can see it right now. Thank you.
Now let me make sure. Is it still there?
Yes, sure.
There. Now I can just show you all a little bit about what was here. But there was that overview. And there's that agenda for today's presentation. Thank you for letting me know. I said, even with all the time I spent moving to online presentations from COVID and whatnot, I'm still not expert at doing the Zoom thing. So if anything else pops up in terms of accessibility, please let me know. So for this slide, it says, what is accessibility? For the purposes of today's discussion, now, hold on one more second. If I push this button here, can you still see my screen? Good, okay. So getting back to our presentation, in order to discuss accessibility, we must first define the term. So for today's presentation, accessibility is going to be defined as the ability to participate in, interact with, connect with, use, and belong to the world around us. Accessibility may not always be typically considered by many on a regular basis. However, for individuals with disabilities, access to education, employment, and the community can be challenging. So it is very important to consider accessibility in planning within our professional lives. So considering accessibility as a professional who works with students, it's important to recognize that all students, regardless of their abilities or disabilities, have equitable access to education. And here on the screen are several different reasons why accessibility is essential. The first one being inclusive learning environments. Prioritizing accessibility fosters an inclusive classroom where every student feels valued and supported. This can lead to greater engagement, participation, as well as a sense of belonging among students. So considering inclusive learning environments is very important within accessibility. The second bullet point here on the screen outlines that legal and ethical responsibilities are important in considering accessibility. Teachers are often legally obligated under laws such as the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, two different laws that we will talk about later in this presentation, to provide accommodations and ensure that students with disabilities have the same educational opportunities as their peers. A third point to consider under accessibility is differentiated instruction. This form of instruction shows that accessibility can allow teachers to use varied methods of teaching that cater to diverse learning styles and needs. So for example, in today's presentation, we're talking about students with visual impairment. So it's going to be real important for students to have access to technology and reading materials such as Braille, large print, and accessible materials to access their environment. These types of differentiated instruction helps students with different backgrounds and abilities to learn more effectively and improve overall outcomes academically, as well as socially and within the community. The fourth bullet point on this slide is fostering independence. By considering accessibility, teachers can empower students to become more independent learners. This boosts confidence and prepares students for future academic and life challenges. Also, with regard to accessibility, reducing barriers to learning is very important. Addressing accessibility helps to identify and reduce barriers that can prevent students from reaching full potential. This might include physical, sensory, or cognitive obstacles that impede learning. And finally, it's important to consider accessibility because it promotes equity. Accessibility is a cornerstone of equitable education. It acknowledges that students may need different tools and resources to achieve similar outcomes and aims to level the playing field so that everyone has a fair chance to succeed. By integrating accessibility into professional practices, psychologists can demonstrate a commitment to fairness, empathy, and high-quality services for all learners. Accessibility begins with the law. with its effects seen in various areas, including, but not limited to, access to education, medical records, transportation, technology, and typical routines within day-to-day lives. Essentially, accessibility affects everything for all individuals. While there are established laws within the United States to protect the rights of individuals with disabilities with regard to accessibility, studies to support individuals diagnosed with low incidence disabilities. And in this case, blindness and visual impairments is a low incidence disability, one that we don't see very often, as well as an awareness of the accessibility practices that meet these needs. It's an area that receives little attention within research literature. While presentations like ours today is an excellent first step in creating awareness of this need, there definitely needs to be more work done. And for you all, especially my students in the room, as future professionals who may be looking for areas of research, this is one where your input can make significant contributions in working with students who have disabilities. So it's definitely something to consider as you step into your professional careers and look towards research opportunities that you yourselves may want to pursue. With accessibility comes inclusion. And in planning for today's presentation, I did read that the purpose of this conference noted that your conference planners wanted you as participants to recognize that in the field of psychology, professionals are expected to develop insight and skills needed to face practical challenges that are related to inclusion. Accessibility leads to inclusion. And in order for professionals to ensure that all students, including those with special needs, can get equal learning opportunities, they must first understand inclusion. An inclusive educational setting is one where all students belong and are given equal opportunity to learn, no matter what their difference is. This does not always mean that all students are going to be in a regular classroom. Settings can definitely vary, and varied settings can still be very inclusive. But it does mean that the educational needs of all students must be met, no matter where they are placed. In order to bring this about, collaboration among a variety of educational professionals is necessary, including collaborations between classroom teachers and, in today's case, our school psychologists. Noting the importance of this collaboration, psychology students who are entering into the world of education must understand how to create an environment that supports and responds to the needs of each individual. And by implementing inclusive strategies, psychology graduates can play a role in facilitating optimal academic and social development for all of your students without exception. So that's really our why. Why do we talk about accessibility? Why do we talk about inclusion? And our next slide dives into a little deeper about why is inclusion important. Local to home here in the United States, inclusive practices for students with special education needs came into existence almost exclusively within the last 50 years. So special education, inclusive practices, and looking at the needs of students with these unique challenges is a relatively new phenomenon here in the United States. Prior to the early 1970s, statistics showed that over 4.5 million children were denied adequate schooling before legislation to ensure that equal opportunities were available for special education children was established. In looking back at the past and looking back at some of the stories from this time, it was definitely a dark time of special education history. And it was outlined in different documentaries that often exposed inhumane treatment of individuals with special needs. And here on the screen is a link. And at the end of my presentation, I can send this to your professors to share with you. Or I can also, once I'm not sharing my screen, put some of these links into the chat box for you if you would like to explore these a little bit more. But one of the most recognized documentaries outlining the history of special education and the treatment that these students received before laws were enacted includes one that was called Suffer the Little Children. And the slide that you can see here, the link at the bottom of here is a direct link to that documentary for those of you who are interested in looking into it a little deeper and hearing a little bit more about how that documentary changed the history of inclusion for students with special needs in the United States. Educational segregation versus integration. These lawsuits, these stories of Pennhurst and these documentaries that were similar to Suffer the Little Children created several lawsuits that occurred because of the mistreatment of patients at institutions across the United States, but with specific regard to the Pennhurst institution. In the early 1970s, multiple landmark court decisions gave states the responsibility to provide special education resources and schooling to students who were in need of it. These cases, these lawsuits, and these decisions altered the entire landscape of special education history in our country. And here on the screen, you can see three significant lawsuits that happened. The first one being Park versus Pennsylvania, which gave a right to education for students with special needs. The second listed here is one called Halderman versus Pennhurst, and this gave legislation for students who have special needs the right to live in society. Prior to this educational lawsuit and this litigation, a lot of students were separated from society in general, often institutionalized. So the Halderman versus Pennhurst litigation was very important in that it allowed people with special needs to actually be integrated back into society. And then finally, the last lawsuit that I have listed here on this screen is Romeo versus Youngsburg. And this one talks about the right to a life that is integrated, but also a life without abuse and neglect. So it essentially gave equal rights to individuals who might not necessarily have been able to advocate for themselves when they were first integrated back into society. Once these legislations began, there were a steady stream of mandates, laws, and decisions that presented special need students with opportunities that were previously unheard of. And this awareness and these litigations established the foundation for quality, individualized education in an accepting, unrestricted environment that actually made independent living an option for these individuals who were once traditionally marginalized and separated from society. These victories were a combination of decades of advocacy and dedication that helped to build a rich selection of special education resources in the United States today, allowing us to have these types of conversations that we're having about the importance of advocacy, accessibility, and inclusion. So the 1970s, with these litigations, with these changes, the 1970s brought more significant improvement to the lives of special education students than any other decade in special education history. First of these laws was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And this act guaranteed civil rights to all disabled people, requiring accommodations for disabled students in schools. So basically what this law did, it said that not only are these students able to start attending public schools, but they also had the right to accommodations that were meaningful for them in these settings. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act guaranteed and enforced the right of children with disabilities to receive free, appropriate education. And this law had a dual purpose of providing unique educational opportunities that were suited to the needs of students with disabilities and delivering it in a place that we call a least restrictive environment. So it didn't necessarily mandate that students had to go into a general education classroom, but they needed to be served in an environment that was the least restrictive to their needs, but still meaningful for their own education. This law, the EHA, or the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, is still the foundational law of modern day special education services in the United States. In 1997, the EHA, or the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, underwent a number of substantial revisions and was renamed to what is more commonly known today here in the United States and also across the world in many different countries, to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA for short. IDEA emphasized the use of individualized education plans, or IEPs, for all special education students. And this law was reauthorized again in 2004, and it remains a precedent for inclusive education for students with special needs today. So it's important to know that the onset of these laws brought about a widespread focus on providing best researched and most effective methods for special education teaching. Not only were students guaranteed an equal education because of these laws, but they were also provided with viable schooling options and the individualized attention that they needed. Having given you that history, now what I want to do is segue a little bit and move into my area of expertise. Let's talk a little bit about an introduction to visual impairments and discuss services for students services specific to students with visual impairments. So noting that this is a low incidence disability, it is one that is often misunderstood. Because this is an area of expertise in my own personal work, for the remainder of today's presentation, I'll share more information about this disability with the hope that I'm able to provide you all with a comprehensive understanding of the fundamentals, the roles, and the pedagogical practices that are essential in effectively working with students who have visual impairments within your future professional roles in psychology. I'm going to begin a little bit here with some myths of blindness. And you'll see here on the screen that I have two myths listed. The first one stating blind people only see darkness, nothing else. This is not true. The reality to this myth is that only approximately 18% of people who are legally blind are classified as being totally blind. The majority of people who are blind can still differentiate between light and dark, and many people who are classified as legally blind can still see a lot of what's happening in their immediate environments and areas. The second myth that I have listed here on the screen is that people who are blind cannot access print or handwritten materials. And again, this is false. In reality, the advent of computers and technology has made nearly any kind of print accessible to people who are blind. Not only is there Braille anymore, but computer software programs can translate print into speech. They can magnify screen images and enlarge texts to readable sizes for people who are classified as legally blind. Occasionally, human readers will take care of the rest. In those instances, you may hear someone call that person a scribe, where they actually read the materials to someone. And in addition to those print materials, students who are totally blind and use Braille as a primary reading material, they can have their materials transcribed into Braille as well. Also here on the screen, you'll see that there are different categories of visual impairments. And the first one being what we call low vision, students who have a visual acuity, an uncorrectable visual acuity of about 2070 to 2200. Legally blind, like I said, it doesn't always mean a complete lack of sight. Students who are classified as legally blind can be anywhere from a 2200 acuity to no light perception, or they can be students who have a severely reduced peripheral field, which basically means that they're looking through almost like a tunnel vision. So if you were to close one eye and then look through your hand, and all of that peripheral field that gets lost, there's some clear focus in the middle of that circle, but within the surrounding areas, that peripheral view is significantly affected, which can also lead to legal blindness. We also work with students who have progressive vision loss. So students who don't necessarily have a visual impairment right now, but they have a condition such as retinitis pigmentosa or a macular degeneration or Stargardt's disease. Students who are progressively losing their vision so that we can teach them how to adapt while they still have some vision and progressively work accommodations and modifications into their learning. And then finally, one of the largest areas of visual impairments nowadays is what we call neurological visual impairments. And these are working with students who have nothing physically wrong with their eye, but their brains are affected in a way that messages cannot be sent from their brain to their ocular system, so they may not see the same as someone with typical vision. On our next slide here, I just have a very short, small visual representation of the degrees of vision loss that I just talked about. So for those of you who are able to see this slide, the very first section here shows a traditional eye chart that you might see in an ophthalmologist's office or an optometrist's office. And the very first section here, it is very clear. That is perfect vision. The second chart that you see is what we consider low vision at 2070. The third chart that you see is where legal blindness begins at 2200. And then that very last section is where a 2400 vision is affected. So it shows those different degrees of vision loss in a one picture short display to sort of understand how degrees of vision loss will affect students who have visual impairments. Depending upon their degree of vision loss, they will have different accommodations and modifications in the classroom. So how do we include these students into classrooms? Important things to know as professionals going into the field. Students who are blind and visually impaired have a right to education. Just like we talked about with the IDEA law, public schools in the United States are required to make available to all children with disabilities, including those students who have low vision, blindness, or partial sight, a free education in a least restrictive environment. They are also entitled to what we call FAPE, or free appropriate public education. Visual impairment is one category of IDEA, and it's a category of disability that does require a medical diagnosis for students to be referred for services. So a medical doctor does get involved in terms of diagnosing students who are served with having visual impairments under the IDEA. And under this same law, the individualized education plan is developed addressing the unique needs of a student who has a visual impairment. As an educational professional, it's important to recognize that just because one student has a visual impairment, Another student will not necessarily need the same accommodations and modifications as another student. So it's very important for every individual to have a team that is specified to that individual, knowledgeable of visual impairments and knowledgeable about the needs of that student to create a plan that's meaningful for them to be integrated and included into a general education setting. In addition to myths of blindness and these facts that we just talked about, there's also some common misconceptions about students with vision loss. And I like to share these because as professionals, I don't want you to fall into this pattern of having these misconceptions. So I do like to share that there are misconceptions about what a visual impairment is and how it affects learning, socialization, emotions, personal and household management, daily living skills, employment or employability, as well as family responsibilities. So it's important to know that people who are visually impaired use numerous learning strategies, skills, and techniques to achieve their daily goals safely, independently, and confidently. These strategies, combined with motivation, intelligence, perseverance, sometimes talent, past experiences, and any other personal qualities that these individuals have, help them to realize their success. While many students with vision loss demonstrate gifts and talents, identification of their gifts can sometimes be complicated by low expectations, poor self-concept, non-challenging environments, and lack of learning opportunities. So in particular, with regard to school psychologists and the psychology field, make sure that you're encouraging high expectations for these students and giving them the tools that they need to be confident in their abilities. There's also a misconception that links vision loss with a lower educational attainment. Looking at the research in this area, in a very simple, synthesized version for this given presentation, I'm simply going to say to you today that research is limited. Education and rehabilitation practitioners tend to publish in rehabilitation journals, such as JVIB or the British Journal of Visual Impairments. And a lot of times, psychology professionals tend to publish in science journals. So sometimes there's minimal overlap between our two fields. So one of the big things I want to tell you is make sure that when you're doing research and you, as becoming professionals who will be working with students who have visual impairments, it's important to recognize these differences and conduct research accordingly. Also, when you're looking into research about how to best help students who are blind or visually impaired, make sure you look across categories. Don't just focus on science or just focus on rehabilitation. Make sure you look across categories to have a broad understanding of what it is these kids need. In terms of looking at the research, one of the more prominent articles in my field by Subban, Farrell, and Monson notes that students with visual impairments have the same curriculum needs as all children, but their visual impairment often imposes restrictions on their ability to access curriculum when it's presented in a typical way of teaching. It's important to recognize that students with visual impairments must be taught necessary skills to obtain access to information, particularly in high stakes environments where they're being presented with and addressed with typical curriculum standards. Without access, this goes back to our accessibility talk, without access, students cannot be successful. One way to establish this was what we call the National Agenda for the Education of Children and Youths with Visual Impairments, including those with multiple disabilities. And here on the screen, I have a link to the National Agenda. Again, I'll send this to your professors and the team who was presenting or putting together the conference today for you. But this is basically a piece of research that sets forth in clear and concise terms a vision and a plan of action for children who are blind and visually impaired, including those who have additional disabilities. And in looking at the national agenda, it basically is a timely, clear-cut way of establishing attainable goals, which all kids can strive for, including those with visual impairments. The goals themselves are written for all age groups, including infants, toddlers, children, and young youths who are visually impaired, and moving into young adulthood. And it includes things like importance of referrals for students to have professionals who work with them, all the way to educational goals and instructions that address academic as well as expanded core curriculum based on the needs of students. So it's a great resource. It's a great way to look at how, as professionals, you can meet the needs of students with visual impairments. And it's one that's a little bit more lengthy than I have time for in our presentation today, but one that you could certainly go to this link and explore a little bit more on your own. In working with children who have visual impairments, there are educational implications of vision loss that need to be considered. However, before diving into those characteristics and giving you ways to actually look at what these kids need, it's important to recognize that students with visual impairments have fewer incidental learning experiences because they're not able to observe objects and interactions. This in itself leads to difficulty with developing concepts. Rather than learning about concepts incidentally as a result of continual exposure to visual information, as many children do, students with vision loss require the teaching of concepts to be a significant part of their educational programs. Without the development of conceptual knowledge and understanding, higher level attainment can suffer. Therefore, as professionals, it's really important to understand that students need what we call explicit instruction. And at this point in my presentation, I like to share a little story as it can be described using a traditional fable that some of you may be familiar with called The Blind Men and the Elephant. This story begins with 6 blind men who heard that there was an animal called an elephant. They were curious about its shape and its form, and out of curiosity, they visited the palace to find out the truth of this mythical creature. One of the blind men, whose hand landed on the trunk of the elephant, said, "This creature is thick, like a snake." For another, who felt the ear of the animal, it seemed like kind of a magic carpet. The man whose hand fell upon the elephant's leg said, "This is like a large cow." And the man who kept his hand upon its side noted that the elephant felt like a wall. Another, who felt the elephant's tail, described it as a rope. And all the while the 6 men were arguing about the creature, the emperor came forth and suggested that they put all the parts together and collectively imagine the vision of the creature. The traditional moral of this story is that truth is relative to one's own perspective. But in the field of education, I love this story because I feel like it's a perfect example of why it is important to ensure that students with visual impairments have access to rich experiences and learning opportunities where they can avoid misconceptions within their education. This is accompanied by having an understanding of the unique needs of students with visual impairments, including educational implications of vision loss, curriculum modifications to support learning, and collaboration among professionals to ensure that proper services are provided. So how do we do this as professionals? Implications of vision loss. Students with visual impairments, because they sometimes have fewer incidental learning experiences, they are not able to observe objects and interactions. So it's important to recognize that all students with visual impairments are affected by a myriad of different things. And here on the slide, you can see that it begins with the type and severity of vision loss. So as a professional in the field, you have to recognize how much or how little a student can see. We also want to talk about when the visual impairment had its onset. Early intervention is important for students who are blind and visually impaired from a young age. Students who have an onset of a vision loss in the middle school or teenage years may have a different way of learning their educational concepts. And individuals who lose their vision in later adulthood have different situations as well. We also want to look at how much intervention is needed, how much residual vision is left, the personality of the student. And this is a big area for you as future psychology majors and future professionals in the field. What kind of things are impacting that vision loss? Is there anger? Is there resentment? Is there acceptance? And as professionals in that field, really looking at how is the personality and the acceptance of the vision impairment affecting their ability to learn? And this is where some of those collaborative approaches to education can come in. Also, we want to look at availability of equipment and resources, presence of other disabilities. Is there a head injury? Is there a physical impairment? Is there a hearing loss in addition to the visual impairment? All of those considerations will affect how students are able to draw on information and access the environment. Goes back to, again, with personality and acceptance. And then the last step in terms of looking at educational implications of vision loss is family involvement. Students who traditionally have more involved families will succeed a little bit more than students who don't have that outside support. So knowing those strengths and weaknesses of the students are so very important. In tailoring education for students who are blind and visually impaired, some people don't know this, so it's one that I wanted to share with you today. In addition to general education curriculum materials, there is a specialized set of concepts that are taught to students with visual impairments that supports learning that is usually done incidentally. Mandated in the United States by the IDEA, teachers of students with visual impairments teach both the general education curriculum as well as what we call an expanded core curriculum. And here on the screen, you will see that there are 9 areas to this expanded core curriculum for students with visual impairments. The first one is compensatory access, and this is basically access to the world. Ultimately, these are skills that are taught to students who are blind and visually impaired to access all areas of the core curriculum. Sensory efficiency teaches students how to use all of their senses, remaining vision, auditory, sense of smell, sense of touch, sense of taste, to function effectively and efficiently within society. The third is assistive technology, and this is one that is forever developing and improving day by day, but technology affects all areas of daily living. And this area of the expanded core curriculum focuses on knowledge and skills essential for using technology in all areas of their daily living. The fourth bullet point here is what we call orientation and mobility. And in the introduction, you heard that I have my master's degree in orientation and mobility. Orientation and mobility is more commonly known as the white cane training that you see people who are blind and visually impaired have. It's learning about an environment and how to move effectively, safely, and gracefully within that environment. The fifth bullet point is what we call independent living. And these are activities that are necessary to take care of oneself, family, and home in order to live as independently as possible. Next, we have social interaction. And these involve all different types of social skills that are present in all aspects of life. particularly again in the area of psychology, when you're working with students, counseling students, it's estimated that almost 80% of what is learned socially within our world is taken in through the sense of vision. So in looking at the social interaction needs of students who are blind or visually impaired, it's important to give them explicit instruction in those areas so that they can integrate naturally within society. Next on the list is what we call recreation and leisure. This is one that we often take for granted as sighted individuals. How do you find downtime and hobbies and enjoyment within your life? Rec and leisure addresses the development of knowledge, behavior, and skills that allows students to participate in a healthy level of recreation and activities for leisure. Career education provides students with visual impairments of all ages, early childhood all the way up to adulthood, to learn skills that are needed for successful employment opportunities. And finally, the last one is self-determination. Again, as psychology majors, these are the skills that enable students to advocate for their personal needs, making independent choices and personal preferences for their goals in life. In working with students who are blind and visually impaired, there are a number of professionals who are trained to work with these students. One specific individual that is sometimes overlooked is what we call the teacher of students with visual impairments. And this is a special education teacher who is trained and certified to provide direct instruction for kids who are blind. The role of the teacher of students with visual impairments, it's not static. It changes according to the needs of each student. If you're ever looking for a profession where it changes day to day on a daily basis, TVI is one for you. It supports the individualized needs of students. In addition to providing services, teachers of students with visual impairments conduct formal and informal assessments. They also often collaborate with educational professionals in understanding and interpreting test results. So as psychology majors, TVI is a person to connect with if you have a student who is blind or visually impaired. These individuals participate in multidisciplinary assessments of infants all the way through teenagers. Oftentimes, they are the primary provider with regard to services. And these are also advocates. A lot of times, teachers of students with visual impairments become very close with family members and other professionals who work with these kids to ensure that the individualized education plan that is established for the child is meaningful and purposeful to that child's needs. In addition to the expanded core curriculum, accessing the general curriculum is important for students who are blind and visually impaired. So it's very important as professionals, again, to have those high expectations of students, to not look down upon them, and ensure collectively that students have the materials that they need to access information. Here on the screen, you'll see several different bullet points that outline things like literacy, technology, low vision devices and accommodations, listening skills, material prep, mathematics, conceptual development, tactile graphics and tactile skills, and organizational and study skills. These are all different important ways for students who are blind and visually impaired to gain skills necessary to help them access that general curriculum. So moving forward, collaboration. Bringing this all together, looking at collaboration, I have this slide here for you to emphasize that collaboration among professionals in serving students with visual impairment is vital. It provides comprehensive support because students with vision loss often require a multifaceted approach to education in all areas, academically, socially, emotionally, mobility needs. So collaborations between teachers special education professionals, and other support staff, including our school psychologists, is so important to make sure that educational needs are addressed cohesively. Students need what are called individualized education plans. The more people that you have involved, collaboration helps create a more well-rounded and effective strategy for serving these kids. Also, that collaboration provides what we call consistency and continuity. When professionals are able to communicate and work together in the best interest of a child, it's important to help reduce confusion and also provide an effort that enhances students the ability to progress academically and socially with the same expectations across the people who are trying to help them. Collaboration is also nice because you can share resources. If you don't understand something as a school psychologist, ask the TVI, ask the O&M specialist, ask the teacher. Be a shoulder to lean on for each other so that you can serve the students in the best way possible. And finally, working with a diverse team really provides opportunities for professionals to learn from one another. So just like in our keynote tonight, our conference tonight, and all of the great things to come up in the next few days for your conference, learning from one another is just so important, especially in areas where you may not have expertise, especially within low incidence populations, such as students who are blind or visually impaired. So bringing it all together, this is where I'm going to wrap up tonight. But it's just important to recognize that accessibility is a concept that focuses on creating equal access for all individuals, including those with disabilities. Accessibility needs should be considered on a regular basis to ensure access to education, employment, and the community. Especially for kids who are blind and visually impaired, this can be challenging. So revisit it once in a while. Don't look at it once and then don't go back to it. Keep this accessibility, keep those thoughts of accessibility at the forefront of your brain when you're working with students. While there are established laws within the United States to protect the rights of individuals with disabilities regarding accessibility, more research is still needed here in the United States and worldwide, my friends. So this is a great way to expand your own research. And then finally, bringing it together, accessibility leads to inclusion. This is vital knowledge for you as school psychologists because inclusion ensures that all students have equitable access to education and opportunities to thrive. Wrapping it up, inclusion is vital for our school psychologists because it ensures that all students, regardless of backgrounds or abilities, have that equitable access to education. And in closing, here on the screen are some key reasons as to why inclusive practices are so essential. The first one being promoting equity. Inclusion promotes equity by addressing disparities in educational experiences and outcomes. It ensures that all students receive the support they need to succeed not only academically, but socially and emotionally. Second bullet point is supporting mental health. Inclusion supports mental health. Noting that school psychologists play a critical role in fostering positive mental health, inclusion promotes a sense of belonging and reduces the risk of social isolation, which is important for students' well-being. Bullet point 3, enhancing social development. Social development within inclusive practice encourages interactions between students with diverse needs and backgrounds, helping them not only to create connections, but to build empathy, communication skills, and collaboration abilities that are essential for life beyond school. Inclusion improves educational outcomes. Research, while it's limited, does show that inclusive environments can enhance academic performance for all students, those with disabilities and those without disabilities. School psychologists can support strategies that accommodate diverse learning styles and foster a culture where everyone can achieve their potential. Promoting acceptance and reducing stigma. Inclusive environments help to normalize differences and reduce the stigma that may sometimes be associated with disabilities or special needs. And it allows students to foster an environment of acceptance and understanding within the school community, hopefully reducing bullying and connecting students in a way that's purposeful and meaningful. And finally, going back to collaboration, inclusion often requires a collaborative approach that involves teachers, parents, and other school staff. School psychologists can help coordinate these efforts and contribute to a cohesive plan that benefits all students. And in conclusion, overall, a focus on inclusion for all students, including those with visual impairments, allows school psychologists to create more supportive, respectful, and thriving educational environments that can meet the needs of every student that you'll be serving in your professional careers. And I think that's almost at an hour there, you guys. I'm going to go ahead and click to the final slide here. Thank you so much for having me this evening or this morning for you. My name is Danene Fast. My contact information is here on the screen, and it's been a pleasure to present with you Seeing Beyond Barriers, Fostering Inclusion for Students with Visual Impairments. If there's any questions or feedback that you have, I'm here for a bit, and I'll turn it over to you or the conference planners.
Thank you, Danene, for the very interesting materials. For all students here, please raise your hand if you have a question. Students who are attending in auditorium or also who attend the Zoom meeting, you all guys can raise your hand. Okay, we have Karin. Mike. In English ya, Karin. Okay.
Do we have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
One question from Karin, I think, who attend in auditorium right now. Please, Karin.
Yeah. Thank you, Miss Julia, and thank you, Dr. Den. That is a very interesting material to begin with. If you cannot see, I am also a disabled student, but the difference is that my disability is physical disability, and as I see, your main focus here right now is in sensory disability that is in the eyes, and of course how we can accommodate those who have that so that they have better chance at receiving education. My question here is a bit personal. How is your experience, or at least how is your interaction with these kids, especially younger kids, and not just like teenagers but more like preschoolers in a way, change your point of view, moreover as a woman and as a health professional? Thank you very much.
That's a great question. In my career, while I focus a lot on visual impairments, I have worked with a multitude of different students in all different categories of IDEA. If you're familiar with IDEA, there's 13 different categories of disability, including students who have orthopedic impairments, physical impairments, traumatic brain injury. And in my experience, I have had the pleasure of working with the multitude of students in a variety of different settings, as well as their parents. Throughout my time in education, I've definitely evolved from being a young 21-year-old teacher, just coming out of my professional career, very similar to where you are at, to actually involving myself with families and other educators, other parents, and then also becoming a mother myself. And my oldest son, when he was in preschool, we ended up having him diagnosed as having a disability. So I actually went through the IEP process as a parent in addition to a professional. So that really changed my perspective on things. So I guess my biggest piece of advice I can give to you is that always reflect on your personal perspectives. Those personal perspectives and those personal experiences you have with families, the stories they share are just so important. And I always tell my own students at Ohio State, the day that I stop learning is the day that I stop teaching. So I love to be able to build on my experiences with students, with families, to continue growing my own knowledge. So empathy has built tenfold over the years, and expectations have grown. When I talk about high expectations for students with disabilities, don't have low expectations for your students. There's also another, and I share this in my inclusion class, for any of you who might be interested. I know I shared in this presentation the documentaries about Suffer the Little Children in Pennhurst, but I also share a YouTube video from an advocate who, she has since passed away, but her name was Stella Young. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Stella Young or not, but she does a phenomenal TED Talk on the importance of what we call disability porn. Like, do not tell people just because they have a disability they're better or that they're inspirational. But she's an advocate who talks about how to advocate for individuals who have disabilities in a way that's meaningful, purposeful, and respectful. So I'll be happy to share that with you as well. But did that answer your question?
That answered my questions beautifully, Dr. Dan. And if I may add one more follow-up question regarding your last answer, how are you seeing the media change or the media evolve from portraying disability to something that is just inspirational to something that is actually functional for people, especially in our society in this day and age with such modern technologies? Thank you very much.
Excellent question. If you look at research from the perspective of how language should be used, there's two differing fields on this. A lot of times, when I'm publishing, I have to say what's called person first language. So there is this belief that even though a person has a disability, that they are a person first, the disability is secondary. So as a non-disabled person myself, it allows me as a non-disabled person to see that person first identity versus a disability first identity. However, in today's society, there's also a second round to that where a lot of people like to identify themselves as disability first. So an autistic person, a blind individual. So that's actually coming from the disability community to actually empower themselves to say, I am a disabled person. This is part of my identity, and it doesn't define who I am. So you ask, it's a loaded question because there are different aspects to it, but it's one that I love to talk to individuals who they themselves actually have disabilities, because I think the feedback that I get is so excellent and empowering. And I always feel like in terms of talking about disability and talking about inclusion and accessibility for people with disabilities, you must have the voice of the consumer. My own dissertation was looking at accessible transportation for individuals who are blind and visually impaired. Part of that research was actually seeking out and interviewing individuals who are blind to ask them, what do you want bus drivers to know? So having that voice of the individual is so important. I also tell my students, don't ever be afraid to ask. If you don't know something, ask. So if you have a friend who does have a disability and you're not sure how to interact with them, or you're not sure what their wants or needs are, it's never wrong to ask first, because you're giving them that opportunity to share what their needs are, what their perspectives are. So as long as you go in with good intentions, I tell them you can't really do wrong as long as you're going in with good intentions.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. That's a very beautiful and wonderful answer. So if I may conclude, it's not just about how the world see them as a person, but moreover, how we ourselves see our bodies as a person. Is that
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Karen, for the question. Maybe we will have one more question from
Sure.
Khairul Umam, who joined in the Zoom. Would you please open your mic and your camera?
Hey, hello. Can you hear my voice?
I can hear you.
Okay, first thing first, I would like to say thank you so much for the great presentation. That is so shortly, open and enlightened, and as a new knowledge for me. That was very great. Thank you for that. And secondly, I would like to ask two questions. The first question is, here in our country, in our nation, not everyone are so aware about, like the disability people or the inclusivity itself, especially on the vision impact. My first question is, how can we, as a professional psychologist or a student of psychology, uh, can make people aware, like make people more aware of, like the inclusivity itself and the student, And the second question is, as like a lot of students, especially in this country, had the common problem, which was like the career path confusion. They had the career path confusion, and like I think the student with the vision impairment also had the same, right? But for people who had no the disability, they can easily put the test on themselves, like the psychological test, to like to determine whether what is their talent, whether what is their the future path career they want to take. But it has become hard. It become for the especially the vision impairment student for doing such a thing, because a lot of psychological assessment are not very friendly with the career path thingy, So is there any way we can provide as a psychologist, or is there any test that is very friendly for our friend, who had the vision impairment, to determine their career path in the future, or how do we help them for that kind of thing? I think that's my question, and thank you.
Those are excellent questions. So, the first one, in building awareness, there are some wonderful international groups that transcend the world in terms of looking at visual impairments. The American Foundation for the Blind, AFB, is one, and we work closely with professionals in the areas of vision rehabilitation, orientation mobility specialists, as well as teachers of students with visual impairments, to get the word out about the profession. In terms of teaching students who are blind and visually impaired, I was going to put this in the chat box for you. There is what we call AERBVI. I think it's the Association for the Education and Rehabilitation of the Blind and Visually Impaired. But if you Google AERBVI, it will take you to their website, and they are a worldwide organization that looks at taking vision professionals in one consistent group so that they can advocate together for the needs of people who are blind and visually impaired across the world. It also is a nice organization because it looks at everything from education to rehabilitation to orientation and mobility to itinerant services versus school for the blind settings. So there's 16 different areas within that organization that will help to find areas that are of interest. They also have been very good at publishing recently and getting out the word about what it means to be blind and how you can advocate for someone who is blind or visually impaired. So that's a good jump off point. If you would want to talk about it more individually, certainly feel free to follow up with an email to me. I can certainly provide you with some more resources. Your second question, this is a wonderful question. When I talk about school psychologists and I talk about the lack of research in the area, specifically working with students who are blind and visually impaired, as school psychologists, it is difficult to find an assessment that works for kids who are blind and visually impaired, especially with regard to career options and academic abilities. So many of the psychological tests that you do, as you know, are visually are visually are vision required, I should say. Like, so looking at different patterns and moving things around, so many things are visual that there has not been, as far as I know, a research-based test that actually is designed specifically for students who are blind and visually impaired yet. And hopefully I can say that word yet. I'm hoping that it's still something that could work. In my own experience, prior to my time in higher education, I worked at the State School for the Blind for 14 years. And as part of my work at the State School for the Blind, I worked hand in hand with our school psychologist doing clinical evaluations of students who are blind and visually impaired. So my role as the teacher of students with visual impairments, I had an understanding of that expanded core curriculum that I talked about, that explicit learning that we talked about, the incidental learning that we talked about. And what I would do is work collaboratively with the school psychologist and use what's called a learning media assessment, which is an assessment that teachers of students with visual impairments can do, a functional vision assessment, which is also another assessment that we do. And we also look at reading assessments. If I'm not sure if you use it in Indonesia or not, but we have, it's called the Jerry Johns inventory for reading. So it looks at reading levels. And those are three evaluations that I was versed in as a teacher of students with visual impairments. And what I would do is work collaboratively with our school psychologist on the assessments that the psychologist was giving, and we would adapt it as much as we could and combine it with other assessments to come up with a career path that supported the IEP and the training programs that we would do with students based on their abilities within different areas of those tests. It's not a standardized test. Unfortunately, I don't think we're there yet. But again, if that's something that you would want to follow up with individually, I'd be very happy to help you navigate that. But I hope that was helpful in terms of your answer.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful answer. So if I may add more so I think it is also become a homework for all of the professional in psychology field to actually develop a more accessible task and assessment, especially for the low and visual impairment student, right? Yeah, okay, so that is
Yeah,
very
that's it's
great
definitely, and yeah,
answer.
say again, I missed the end of that.
I think Umam has a poor connection.
Well, Umam, if I can't talk with you now, follow up in an email with me. I'd be happy to respond back.
Okay. I will say to Umam to send you a message or email if he still has a question for you, Danin.
That sounds
Okay.
great.
Okay, Danin. We have a very braingasm discussion with you actually, and we would like to thank you again for your materials and very interesting discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor talking with you, and I wish you all the very best in your future careers.
Yes, sir. Do you have some more maybe like added statement, especially for our students?
Just in terms of advice,
Yes, sir. You may.
inclusivity is very important. I love that you are doing this conference in Indonesia. Part of the reason I was here today is because one of your peers is also a student of mine here at Ohio State. So it's been a pleasure to have these cross collaborations between the United States and Indonesia. And like I said earlier, the day you stop learning is the day you stop teaching. So I look forward to hearing more from you and reaching out to you more about your questions of inclusion and also learning more about how things happen in Indonesia and those connections that we can have across countries together. So thank you all so much, and I wish you all the very best with your studies and your future endeavors.
Sir, we hope we can see you again in the future, Danin. Maybe you can come in Indonesia in the future.
That would be amazing. I've never been to Indonesia. I've been as
Oh,
far
really?
west as Japan. So I think Indonesia would be the next best thing to keep traveling.
Okay, we will let you know if we have some grant or some funded if we can invite you here.
That sounds lovely.
Okay. Thank you again for your materials and nice discussion. Have a very good night, Danin.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Please give a round applause, guys. Okay, now we will move to the second session. Please remain on your seat, guys. We will have Marveggio and we will have a discussion about NDIS. And the session will be led by Bu Ika Widyarini. So I will pass the mic and the seat to her. Maybe we will have about 5 minutes break for the session preparation. Thank you. Okay. Good morning. I think it's good afternoon for Mark and Diana. Please open your mic and also your camera. We would like to pin the.
Yeah, sorry, I thought my camera was open.
Hi, Mark.
How are you, Ika?
How are you?
Oh, not too bad, thank you. And yourself?
Oh, okay. I think we can start right now. Do you need more break or not? Okay. Well, it's 10:40 here in Indonesia. I think it's about afternoon in Adelaide. And thank you for agree to give a presentation here, Mark. I would like to introduce you a bit for our student here. Well, can you see it right now?
Yeah, I can see your screen. So you've got my
Okay.
profile up.
Mark here is a Ph.D. candidate from the School of Psychology, Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences at University of Adelaide, under the supervisor of Professor Diana Dorstin and also Professor Deborah Turnbull and Dr. Epi. So his topic of research is broadly centered on Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme. So we met a very brief session in Adelaide, and we are talking about how Australia managed their working age people with disability, and it was not under the ruling of legislation like here in Indonesia, where disabled person has specific rules that they can work in any company organization, and it was ruled by the state. But in Australia, they have NDIS, National Disability Insurance Scheme, which focus on giving they are having this scheme of insurance to make sure that the disabled person have activity and also function as part of the community. So without further ado, and right now he is working at NDIS also as one of the staff, probably local area coordinator. And I think it's better for Mark to explain what it is himself. Okay, without further ado, I give the time and also your the screen for you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Ika. Just get my presentation up when I can share the screen, and should be good from there. I think you need to stop screen sharing. Well, if you let me share it, Ika, I can go through it nice and quickly, if that's okay.
Okay. You need to share your because
yeah, if you
I can share your presentation here.
I've got it open on mine then.
Or you prefer to share it yourself?
Yeah, I can share it from mine. Might make it a little bit easier.
You can share it because we already give you a co-host position.
Has it come up?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, perfect. All right. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure talking to you all about both my project and my work. Today I'll be talking to you all about the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia, as well as supporting people with disabilities as a local area coordinator. If there's time also, I'll briefly touch upon my project, which is exploring interventions and supports for Australians living with a disability. on the NDIS. So before I begin proper, just in Australia, it's very common for us to give an acknowledgement to country, and I'd just like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the land that I'm coming to you from today. I would like to acknowledge their deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and pay my respect to their past, present, and ongoing connection to the land. So in order to give you a sort of a full idea of the NDIS and what disability is like in Australia, I'll be covering a little bit of the history of disability in Australia and the early history of the NDIS. I'll be covering the NDIS itself, including what it takes to access the NDIS, how funding works, and how to get support. I'll also briefly touch upon the NDIS review, which covers a lot of the difficulties that we have faced in the implementation of the NDIS. And then I'll also be talking on the practical application of the local area coordinator role, which I was in for 3 years between 2021 and 2024. And if time, I'll cover my project. So, disability support prior to the NDIS. So the National Disability Insurance Scheme is the realization of decades of struggle for disability rights advocates and for grassroots campaigns that were often led by people with disabilities. So prior to the 1970s, most people in Australia who had a disability were often housed in institutions or in asylums. But in the 1970s, there was a move to put people back into the community, into community care settings, when we sort of realized that sort of arrangement of having people in institutions was not wholly appropriate and didn't really align with our ideas of human rights. Back then, our state governments and territory governments, they were responsible for disability services and supports. And most of those state governments used what was called a block funding approach. And in most Western countries, it was a very common social welfare model when it came to disability. And what it meant was that the disability service providers themselves were funded directly to provide supports to people with disabilities. Now, there's a lot of benefits and ease to such a model, obviously. You know who's providing the supports and you know where to get the support. But the downside is, of course, that it takes a one-size-fits-all approach. So, very much an idea of only certain people and certain disabilities being able to access such funding. And even if you were able to access those supports, you often had a very limited range of services and they couldn't really respond to a range of diverse needs. So a lot of the previous block funding modelling also really catered towards with people with either fairly significant physical disabilities or people with more profound intellectual disabilities. So it missed a lot of people somewhere in the middle where they had a form of a disability, but was never considered severe enough. I don't really like that term, but severe enough to require support. But after sort of decades of funding, in 2007, Australia signed on to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And in 2008, the Australian government signed the National Disability Agreement, which was looking to federalise its approach to disability. In 2011, the Council of Australian Governments endorsed the National Disability Strategy that had been developed for the 2010 to 2020 period. And that included replacing the then current system, so those state models, with a national approach that would be called the NDIS. It wasn't until March 2013 that Federal Parliament passed the Act that enabled the NDIS to come into effect. And it started with a very gradual rollout. It started with 4 sites in July of 2013, 2 in sort of semi-regional areas, 1 in New South Wales and Victoria, 1 for all children aged 0 to 14 in South Australia, and for all people aged 15 to 24 in Tasmania. So the rollout begins, and by July 2020, it's complete, and there are 392,000 people receiving support at that time. So by the scheme rollout being complete, what it meant was all the people who had been on those previous block funding models were now on the NDIS. That didn't mean that there weren't other people that were now able to access NDIS supports. In fact, there was a lot more people who were able to. And so as of June 30 this year, there are now a grand total of about 661,000 active participants with an approved plan, and about 10,400 children accessing early supports. As you can guess, the NDIS ends up being quite expensive. It's the third largest expense for our federal government, at about $36 billion in the 2022-2023 period, behind the disbursement of GST to the states and territories and our supports for seniors. And it's estimated that the NDIS is going to blow out to an extra $20 billion per year, and will be very quickly overtaking the supports for seniors. So it's quite a lot. But the next question is obviously, well, what is the NDIS? So the NDIS is what now provides funding to all Australians with a disability who are able to meet access for the scheme. Underpinning it is choice and control. So it's fundamental to the NDIS, and we're trying to align with the United Nations Conventions on that rights of persons with a disability. It's really trying to put it back into the hands of people with disability to have more choice, more freedom, and more control over their lives. So unlike previous block funding models, the participants are given a budget from which they can directly purchase supports and services to suit their disability needs. There are obviously access requirements. You can't just get on for having a disability. So in order to get onto the scheme, you need to first be under 65 years of age when you make an access request. If you're over 65 years of age, you apply for an aged care package. And if you're 65 years old, if you turn 65 while you're on the NDIS, you have the option of staying on the NDIS or moving to an aged care package, depending on your preference. The other obvious access requirement is that you must reside in Australia and either be an Australian citizen, a permanent resident, or on a protected or a special category visa. So it's important that you are in Australia, so Australian citizens who live abroad can't access the scheme. But to get on for disability, there are a few other things that are required. So if you've met the age requirements and the residency requirements, you then also have to meet the disability requirements. And you have to demonstrate that you have a disability that is attributable to one or more intellectual, cognitive, neurological, sensory, or physical impairments, or you have a psychosocial disability which results in an impairment. Secondly, the impairment that results from that disability needs to be or is likely to be permanent. So it's not enough to have a disability, it also needs to be a disability that results in an impairment that's permanent. And that impairment needs to result in a substantial reduction in your functional capacity to undertake one or more of the following activities: communication, social interaction, learning, mobility, self-care, or self-management. On top of that, that impairment then also needs to impact upon your ability and capacity for social participation or economic participation. And you also need to be assessed as requiring NDIS supports under the NDIS for your lifetime. So there's a lot there and there's a lot to unpack, certainly. But key among that, and the one that I hope that you really take from that, is not enough to have a disability. It also needs to result in that impairment. So having a disability isn't enough. So just having that label is not enough. There also has to be some functional impact on your life. And when they're talking about permanency there, that's permanent regardless of whether or not you can do anything about it. So, for example, if you have major depression, it's not enough to have major depression to get onto the NDIS. You'd also need to have a form of depression where you have trialed, a range of different antidepressants, and they are either partially or ineffective, even when you are, appropriately medicated. All right. So once you get on, you then are able to access the funding and supports. So participants are provided a plan based upon their disability needs, which includes a budget. So the plan itself is based upon a planning meeting, and the planning meetings occur at first access and also every 1 to 3 years, depending on the length of your plan. The budget enables participants to choose and purchase those supports directly from a provider rather than, being told these are the services available to you. Rather, they get to choose where they want to go, who they want to access support from. All funded supports must meet reasonable and necessary criteria, which is known as Section 34, and I'll be covering that a little bit later. And the funding is broken up into 3 domains, each that have their own categories. There's core, capacity building, and capital. So capital supports, just to break them up a little bit, capital supports covers assistive technologies and home modifications. So assistive technologies are all supports, so sort of like a physical support that costs more than $1,500. As a few examples, there can be wheelchairs, or it can be prosthetics, hearing devices as well, vehicle modifications, and even assistance for animals all fall under the assistive technologies budget. And home modifications as well. That can be any part of the home where substantive works are required and they are related to the disability. And it can be in any part of the house, and it can even be to new builds. So bathrooms, kitchens, laundries, bedrooms, electrical and door automation, which is a very important one for people who are wheelchair users. Cabinetry alterations, so that you can sit or so that you can say access your kitchen bench tops and stuff like that. Even the external pathways and ramps. Air conditioners are also funded, but they're generally reserved for people with multiple sclerosis who also have thermoregulation disorder, so they can't modulate their own body temperature. In terms of core, this is where we often find funding for support workers. So it's broken up into 4 categories: assistance with daily activities, which, broadly speaking, is just support workers who provide support inside the home. It can include things like cooking, cleaning, and gardening, but also self-care activities. So if you are unable to get out of bed or unable to shower independently, support workers there can also assist you. Funding for respite is also provided there. There's also assistance with social and community participation. So these are support workers who provide support with activities outside the home. So that can be one at the one-to-one level or group access, and it can include also activities in the community itself or in centres, which is often known as day options. So places where people go where they may not be able to engage in employment and can't be left alone. Supports for employment are also funded in this section. So in the previous block funding model, the disability employment services and providers used to be funded directly from the government. Now people can pick which one they want to go to and can receive support to engage in employment. So this will include, that should have been at the top, so I apologize there. Consumables is also funded here. This is for low-cost assistive technology, so anything under $1,500. And often it's consumable items such as continence aids for people who are unable to, work their own continence, hand accessories, breathing buttons. But there are also other low-cost AT, so a walking stick or a walking frame, or orthotics or grip rails might be there. For some reason as well, Auslan, so that's Australian Sign Language, is also funded under consumable. And then finally, there's transport, which is just a small amount that people are able to get if they can't drive and they can't catch public transport independently as a result of their disability. And then the final area is capacity building supports, and it's probably the most important. So there's about 9 different categories. The improved life choices is plan management funding. So for people who can't manage their own invoices, a plan manager can do that for them, saves a lot of time and hassle. Improved daily living is where most therapies are funded, and that will include psychology, occupational therapy, speech therapy, physiotherapy, basically anything where the therapist is going to be providing that capacity building, so that development skills. Improved relationships is where a positive behaviour support practitioner is funded, and it's typically for participants who have behaviours of concern, and is used to help extinguish those behaviours as best as possible. Increased social and community participation is mentoring support, so typically for younger persons who require support to transition into adulthood. Improved health and well-being is where dietetics, exercise physiology, and personal training might be funded, and it's typically for people who have a physical disability or who may require disability-related support to engage in healthy living and activities. Finding and keeping a job is where what's called school leaver employment supports is funded, so it's generally supports for participants who have recently finished school and need some support to develop their job-related skills. Improved home living arrangements is assistance with accommodation and tenancy obligation, and improved learning is much like that, finding and keeping a job, but more supporting the transition from secondary school to tertiary education. Now, you might be thinking that that is a lot for anybody to really take in and understand. So there's one more category which might be funded, which is support coordination. And this is for people who can't independently manage their own plans and don't have informal supports or family members who are able to assist them in the management of their own plans, and who may also have further vulnerabilities or concerns, which may add a layer of complexity to their support needs. That support coordinator's role is to connect a participant to NDIS funded supports and services and ensure that their plans are utilised effectively and appropriately. So if you've gotten onto the NDIS and you've had your first planning meeting and you're having a discussion about what supports you need, the thing that everyone will talk about is reasonable and necessary. So regardless of the support or which area it is funded under, all funded supports need to meet what we call reasonable and necessary. So the first is that the support is necessary to address the needs of a participant arising from an impairment for which they met access. So, for example, if you are to translate that, the support needs to meet the disability needs that the person has met access for. So you may have a person with an intellectual impairment who has a sore back. Unfortunately, they can't get physiotherapy. That impairment isn't related to their intellectual disability. And you may notice that it's got AA written next to it. That is the actual legislation or the partner legislation. And it's AA because the Act recently went through an update and they had to add that in because while it was implied previously, it wasn't directly stated. So the second criteria is that the support needs to assist the participant to pursue the goals, objectives, and aspirations included in their plan. So each plan, a participant needs to put in goals, and those goals need to sort of align with what they would like to achieve in this plan period and out of their life more generally. There's a broad array of goals. And, they can be as simple as I would like to make more friends to something more complex or overwhelming, like I would like to travel independently overseas. They're both acceptable goals, though what we will and won't fund is really dependent upon what we are able to fund, not necessarily what you think should be funded. The support also needs to assist the participant to undertake activities, especially to facilitate the person's social and economic participation as well. So in other words, it needs to have some benefit, especially the social and economic participation. The support also needs to represent value for money in that the cost is going to be reasonable relative to the benefit achieved and the cost of any alternative support. So oftentimes we're comparing different supports to each other. So if a person needs to get a wheelchair, there may be a question as to what is the most cost-effective wheelchair for that person. And there's a lot of considerations there. When it comes to therapies, there may be a question of, well, a common one that people often try to get funded was ABA therapy, where the ABA therapist often wants about 9 hours a week, whereas a lot of occupational therapists or speech therapists might say, well, I only need an hour a fortnight. So in which case we're looking at a big difference in the cost and the reasonableness of that cost. Next, the support will be or is likely to be effective and beneficial for the participant, having regard to current good practice. So, it needs to be the most up-to-date intervention or support, and it needs to obviously be good practice. And the funding or the provision of support also needs to take into account what is reasonable to expect of families, of carers, of informal networks, and the community to provide. So an important thing about the NDIS is that they don't really want to take over the responsibilities of families or of the community or informal networks. They really want to just aid in people being able to maintain those connections with their families and with their community and their informal networks. So, a common one that was asked was from parents with a child with intellectual disability or autism. They might often ask, well, can we get a support worker to help us out? And the answer is often no, because that is a parental responsibility to parent your child. But obviously there are, some caveats there. But broadly speaking, if it's something that we would expect families to do, then we're really not going to fund that. And finally, the support is an NDIS support for the participant. Don't worry too much about that one, but it does have to be an NDIS support, as opposed to something that's better funded by the medical system or the education system. There's also a whole lot of other reasonable and necessary criteria that it needs to align with. I'm not going to cover them all. I'm just trying to highlight that one of the big problems that you might already be seeing about the NDIS and how people with disabilities may encounter it. So the next point is the NDIS review. So in 2022, the Minister for the NDIS, Bill Shorten, announced a review into the NDIS, and it released 2 reports, one in June of 2023, the What We've Heard report, and another in December, the final report called Working Together to Deliver the NDIS. It heard from about 10,000 people. It received 4,000 submissions, and it spoke to over 1,000 people with disabilities and spent more than 2,000 hours listening to those people. It offered 26 recommendations and 139 actions to help in change and improve the system. The key findings, and some of these may be a little bit shocking, and some of them may be things you've already worked out. So the key findings in regards to data, research, and knowledge is that the NDIS doesn't actually measure the key indicators of its performance, including social and employment access. The NDIS has outcomes framework, and they're not fit for purpose. Its measurements are limited, and they're not directly linked to any of the scheme costs. The current monitoring processes aren't sufficient to improve the outcomes of either the scheme or participants. It's not set up in a way that enables continuous learning, and the data is currently structured to support actuarial analysis. So in other words, the NDIS, when they're reviewing their data, it really just shows how much the scheme has cost and how much it's likely to continue costing within any particular period, which, if you're thinking, doesn't really align all that well with, whether or not people are actually developing their skills and whether it's assisting people with disability, you'd be correct. The National Disability Insurance Agency doesn't capture data about what supports and interventions work, for whom and why. And despite being legislated to do so, the NDIS does not sufficiently fund research comparable to how medical research is funded in Australia. Now, I put a little asterisk on the does not sufficiently fund because it is starting to fund a lot more research into disability in Australia, but I would still argue it's not comparable to how much medical research is funded. And finally, the NDIS does not translate knowledge into practice by providing up-to-date knowledge to support providers and workers of what works and what is best practice. And so you might have seen, obviously, a lot in regards to how much there is there about the NDIS, about how many different things need to be covered and what happens, and even just getting supports in might sound like a nightmare. And that's another finding of the NDIS review in terms of the participant experience. So reasonable and necessary, the criteria for getting any support, was considered a legally technical, complex and broad discretionary concept, and it has irresolvable tensions. So the criteria was kept broadly defined in the legislation on purpose. It was meant to enable it to flexibly respond to every individual need and circumstance, but what ended up happening is that there's a lack of clarity about what it is. There's confusion about how to apply it, and what the scheme should fund is often contested. Further, the current approach actively requires every individual support to be considered reasonable and necessary, and that's further compounded the problem. It leads to the reasonable and necessary being contested for every single item in the plan. And many participants end up finding the planning process very stressful and traumatizing because it's adversarial in nature, and there's often the feeling that planners who approve budgets are often trying to limit the budgets rather than working together to really create a program that's going to help the participant. And oftentimes it means that participants need to present themselves in the worst light possible in order to justify the supports and that they're needing. So this is where I sort of came in as a local area coordinator. So a local area coordinator is a partner position with the NDIS. So we're not funded directly by participants, so they don't purchase us through their NDIS plan. Rather, we are connected directly with the NDIS, and our job is to help deliver the NDIS in specific local government areas. So I was working in the southern Adelaide region, and I was looking after was part of three different local governments in South Australia. And so part of our role is helping our participants in our caseload and in our local government area to find practical information that might help them. And that includes information about disability, their rights and supports and services, help people to understand the NDIS and access the NDIS, which hopefully I've sort of covered why that is necessary. Help with an NDIS plan. So to eligible persons, we might help gather evidence of their current situation, their supports and their goals to help develop a plan. And we also help implement a plan. So we assist participants to understand and use the supports in their NDIS plan to help them achieve their goals. And oftentimes a local area coordinator was a participant contact person within the NDIS for any discussions that they might require or questions about their plan. And we also support in plan reassessments. So obviously it's not just one plan and that's all you ever get. The plans are often reassessed on a yearly, once every 2 years or once every 3 years, depending on how it's traveling. We also assist with what are called community connections. So another core part of the LAC role is for people with and without plans. LACs are meant to support people to connect to their local community, and especially non-funded support. So this would include local libraries, volunteering opportunities, community and social organisations in the area, such as sporting clubs or performing arts groups. Health and medical professionals, such as supporting people to find a new general practitioner or a psychiatrist, and other government services such as education and transport. So when I was in LAC, there was also a further role that we had to do, and that was planning meetings. So we used to conduct planning meetings and build plans for participants. Now, we weren't responsible for approving the plans, that still had to sit with the agency. But one of the things that I found is in order to actually support a participant appropriately, oftentimes planning meetings required at least 1 to 3 hours to do properly. So that included updating information in the system, as well as all the other things that go along with a good planning meeting. And they were often face-to-face with the participant or their parents, if it was a child participant, other nominated representatives or other interested parties, such as a support coordinator or an advocate. Planning meetings themselves were a discussion of the current plan and the future plan. So, the entire aim of a planning meeting was to find out what was working and what was not working, and what supports had been recommended by end of plan service reports, what supports were being requested, and also why that was the case, how that would support a participant to achieve their goals and continue to develop capacity. And we, would also discuss any changes in life circumstances that may have occurred. So, as you can imagine, people's lives are complex, and oftentimes we were catching a lot of people who were in transition phases, a lot of people who were moving out of home for the first time, or people who were getting into employment or looking to get into employment for the first time. And so, those are big life circumstances for people. And the same is true of people with disabilities. We'd also end up reviewing participant goals, and that would include rewriting old goals or developing new goals. That, for me, oftentimes took a long time, because it's very easy to drill down into the details of what it means to even, approach a goal and support somebody to meet that goal. So, for example, for a social goal, if we had a goal around, I would like to, develop my social skills so I can, make more friends, there was often a question of, okay, well, where do we really start? For some people, it started at, needing to know how to do a reciprocal social interaction. So to be able to engage in a conversation where there is a back and forth, as depending on where a person was in their life stage, they might not even know how to hold that sort of a conversation. On top of that, we're also required to collect all end of plan reports. We had a KPI, so a key performance indicator, and we needed to complete 4 plan builds per week, and that's on top of all of our other duties, supporting people to connect to their local communities. And due to the workload, it was unfortunately about the only time participants would have to contact their LACs. And an LAC was responsible for organising that planning meeting, following up with all service providers, and collecting any further information from subject matter experts or following other internal guidance, to ensure we built that plan appropriately. One of the things I really want to stress is that when we were supporting participants, like, every participant is different, and even 2 people, same age, same gender, and same disability may have very discordant needs when it comes to their individual circumstances. So one of the things that really required a lot of work was that time to develop that firm understanding of the individual participant, their disability, their support needs, and what services and supports were appropriate for their needs and circumstances, and really supporting them to connect to those services. So after the planning meeting, the plan then had to be built. So this included building the plan and the supports, and writing justifications for each line item or support that was included in the plan. If we go back, obviously, to what I said about the NDIS review, about everything being contested, that was very much true for when I was building plans. Any support that I built in, I would have to explain why I built it in, and I would need to demonstrate why it met reasonable and necessary criteria, and I had to meet all of them. So as just a simple demonstration, and this is certainly nothing like the system that we used, but even just for 3 different supports, so occupational therapy, speech pathology, and skills development and training, including public transport training, I would need to justify why it was a fortnightly duration, I would need to justify what why an occupational therapist was reasonable and necessary, and what that intervention aimed to achieve and how it aimed to achieve it. And then I'd have to do the same again for speech pathology, and then I would have to do the same again for skills development and training. And bear in mind, that's just one small area in what might be a fairly uncomplicated plan. For people with, a lot of several disabilities or more complex disabilities, you might have somewhere between 15 to 30 line items that you have to individually justify each time. And that can take a lot. Once the plan had been built, though, it would then be sent to a delegate or an NDIA planner. We call them delegates because they are delegated with the responsibility to approve a plan. And there was 4 possible outcomes. One was a plan could be approved with no changes. A plan could be approved with some minor changes. The plan could be rejected, especially if the work required to amend it was greater than 2 hours or some procedure had not been followed, and there was a lot of procedures in the agency. Or the 4th option was a plan alignment meeting needed to occur, where a discussion between the plan builder and the plan approver, if the delegate felt that they needed to make changes that would be greater than 20% of the submitted plan. If we had a plan alignment meeting, some were short conversations and some were not. But regardless of that, all required a detailed understanding of the participant and their circumstances, the evidence that supported the plan build and where to find it, knowledge of the disability, knowledge of the local service area, and knowledge of different services and how they could support a participant to build capacity, and how all of those different services would then meet reasonable and necessary. Ultimately, the final decision was on the plan, as they were the ones delegated with that responsibility. But supporting a participant, even just to access the NDIS, required a lot of support, a lot of understanding, not just of people and disabilities, but the local service area in which they were going to be supported, which you can imagine is quite stressful and requires quite a lot of time and patience. Once the plan was approved, the next step was then to implement the plan. Now, for experienced participants or, informal supports, implementing the plan could be as simple as just providing a breakdown of the plan build. So I might submit a plan with the recommendations, might come back with some slight changes. So I would then need to give a breakdown of what was funded and what was not funded, and the justifications that might be given for not funding a certain support. But other participants sometimes require further assistance in understanding their plan, and that might include support to connect to the supports, or knowing where to find services and what to look for when selecting services, or even knowing which services are going to be appropriate to their needs. Could also be knowing how to use their plan and apply that reasonable and necessary when they're selecting the supports. Might even just be how to pay invoices or how to use the NDIS's online tool. So as a bit of an example as to what that assistance might look like, one of my early participants, the one who had also just come onto the scheme, was a lady who had a laryngectomy. So essentially, she'd had her larynx removed and she had a permanent hole in her throat. And in order to talk, she had to push down on a stoma button, as that let the air pass over that hole and out her mouth. So part of my job was there just to make the phone calls for her to, as she was a bit of an older lady, she didn't really know how to use the internet and wasn't comfortable with it. So I was there making phone calls to different service providers. But it really depends on the person and where they're at. Regardless, each participant and their supports, they were different and they needed to be supported in different ways that met those needs. So that was my role, and in terms of what I did. Now, there's a lot of questions that you may have, but just quickly, I'll just cover on what my project is and how we're hoping to address that. So I'm looking at exploring the interventions and supports that Australians living with a disability on the NDIS, what's available to them. I'm starting with a scoping review of all the NDIS interventions for child and adolescent participants with cognitive impairments. So my scoping review at the moment entails 3 different key concepts, and that roughly equates to about 54, 55 different search strings as part of the search. During screening, we focused on the studies in which an intervention being very broadly defined, was investigated. And we're trying to map those interventions onto the NDIS framework of daily living, choice and control, health and well-being, relationships, community, participation, work and learning, and provide a narrative synthesis of those studies and results. And if you wish to have a look, it's been pre-registered on the Open Science Framework, and you can also see the protocol there. But despite the expense of the scheme, and it is a very expensive scheme, our search, and I tried to be quite systematic in my search, of 16 databases across 11 different platforms only yielded about 1,343 studies, of which 529 were duplicates. So at the title and abstract screening phase, we only had 814 studies. I say only, but compared to a lot of other meta-analyses, sometimes they number in the thousands. And we only ended up excluding 175. Now, I put that down to me being a very junior researcher and wanting to include everything, but we ended up having 629 studies that were available for a full text screening, and we excluded 606. So we really only led down to 33 studies included in the review, and that's with a very, very broad definition, as I said, of what it means to have what an intervention is. So we're currently in the process of extracting the data, so I don't have a lot to tell you at the moment, except for that the studies that we did find, they're not very unguided. Oftentimes, it is people who have already got an intervention, or something that they've been keenly interested in, and they're just seeing whether it works in that Australian context, and then trying to see how that might apply for the NDIS. But following on from that, we're going to be doing a scoping review on service providers, and we're looking at the changes in the provider spaces, from education and training to the conduct and the practice of development and policy. So really looking at how the NDIS has impacted how different service providers, may be trained differently, or how they may be, practicing differently, especially with that person-centered approach, the person with a disability, rather than, the government or what the family or other people might want of them. And the intention again is to map that research. The third project we'll be looking at is a surveying of those service providers, and really looking at how support services and interventions are chosen. So really getting at that idea that the NDIS review picked up, that we don't know what works for whom and why. So really looking at the providers and asking how they choose those services and how they apply best practice, and looking also at how much time is really required to support participants effectively. You may have noticed that I said it takes about 1 to 3 hours to conduct that planning meeting, and that's just the planning meeting, effectively. But depending on the participant, and depending on the level of complexity in that person's life, I had one meeting that went for 5 hours, and there was a lot of complexity there, and you're talking with a lot of people, parents, and other people who are involved, and navigating the NDIS was almost a hazard in their life. So being able to support them and meet their needs is going to be important. And so hopefully this project might then also make it easier for picking of different supports and services. And depending on my timing and my ability to stay on task, there may be even time for another project or review. So that's my presentation, and I've provided a list of references. I believe I've sent the presentation to you, Ika, so feel free to share that with anyone who's interested. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening. I've put my contact details on the screen. want to also thank you, Ika, for inviting me to present. Hopefully, your students found this interesting and got something out of it. Hopefully, I was able to provide something. And if you have any questions, feel free to follow up now or email or catch me on LinkedIn.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Well, so many information, but one thing I would like to confirm before we go to the question and answer session. Who, I think it's because it's insurance scheme, then it must be there is a certain amount of premium has to be paid by the person or the family of the disabled person to support the plan, or is there any government help in giving the fund?
Yeah, so there isn't actually any premiums that are paid. So the insurance scheme, while it is called an insurance scheme, the idea there is less that it works like insurance regularly works, and more is the idea that we fund to support participants now to reduce costs, longer term. So the insurance is more the mindset of how the supports and services are meant to work. But otherwise, it's funded directly by the taxpayer. So, so the NDIS is fully. There's no cost to any of the participants. They're provided a budget from which they are able to select services and supports. The main aim, however, is that services and supports that they select should be working towards building and developing their capacity so that the cost of individual plans decreases over time.
Oh, okay.
So that's sort of
there,
what they mean by
there is
insurance.
a government help in support the insurance premium, right? And also,
Well, then there's no premium. There's no premium.
Yes.
It's fully funded. It's fully funded by the government.
Oh,
So,
fully funded by the government.
Yeah,
Okay.
fully funded by the government. So, yeah.
So good. Thank you.
Yeah, all good.
Glad to know that.
Yeah.
So, is there any question from any students? Maybe please allow me to summarize all the your presentation in Bahasa Indonesia, probably.
Yep.
Jadi di Australia itu meskipun namanya asuransi, tetapi semua orang yang penyandang disabilitas itu berhak untuk dibantu oleh pemerintah. Jadi mereka harus mendaftarkan diri. Jadi ada 3 hal yang dipastikan harus di-provide oleh pemerintah. Ya, jadi 3 hal itu adalah jadi mereka harus daftar di insurance scheme ini. Yang pertama itu adalah core. Core itu tadi yang termasuk misalkan perlu kaki palsu, perlu hearing aid, perlu kursi roda, kayak gitu-gitu. Jadi mereka tuh harus berfungsi secara penuh di sosial dan lain sebagainya. Kemudian ada capacity building. Mereka itu berhak untuk sekolah dan setelah sekolah pun mereka juga berhak untuk dibantu untuk bekerja, kayak gitu-gitu. Bahkan perusahaannya juga dibayar kalau mereka mempekerjakan penyandang disabilitas. Ini yang sangat menarik ini ya. Kenapa kok banyak sekali orang disabilitas yang bisa bekerja di sana. Kemudian yang capital ini itu mungkin tadi udah kalau sekiranya perlu hal-hal yang lain. Jadi modal misalkan untuk memulai usaha dan lain sebagainya. Jadi agak berbeda dengan Indonesia. yang ya udah kalau disabilitas ya semua orang harus diberi pekerjaan, tapi nggak ada, kemudian tidak ada ininya apa tindak lanjutnya dan lain sebagainya, dan kita harus berusaha membuat perusahaan itu menerima ini dari sudut pandang Pio ya. Jadi perusahaan itu harus menerima difabel, tapi itu pun tidak ada apa kayak misalkan petunjuk pelaksanaan gimana caranya merekrut, bagaimana caranya. Kalau tadi bahkan di rumahnya itu kalau perlu dibuatkan rem supaya disabilitas yang perlu penyandang disabilitas yang perlu pakai kursi roda kemana-mana itu bisa. Bahkan nanti kayak misalkan tram atau kereta itu betul-betul di gak kayak di Indonesia gitu kan. Bahkan orang normal pun naik kereta itu kan sulit kayak gitu ya. Itu bawa koper dan lain sebagainya. Oh, mereka tuh sama pintu landainya sehingga orang yang pakai kursi roda dengan gampang masuk ke kereta kayak gitu. Mungkin ada pertanyaan, monggo. Dalam bahasa Indonesia juga boleh. Nanti bisa saya terjemahkan ini, kalaupun misalkan. Harus ada yang tanya dua, kalau enggak boleh pulang. Enggak ada. Ayo, monggo tanya. Mumpung ada yang bisa ditanyai di sini. Ada yang mau bertanya tentang sistem Australia, dan itu yang terakhir tadi studinya dia. Kenapa kok anak intervensi harus datang? Itu karena dia sedang meneliti tentang intervensi yang yang paling efektif untuk bisa diberikan kepada para penyandang disabilitas agar mereka itu beraktivitas. Itu eh, pekerjaan utamanya. Mau beraktivitas, mau engage di sosial ini kayak gitu. Tidak ada yang mau nanya, tidak tertarik. Ibu-ibu mungkin yang sebelah sini, daripada sebelah sini diam aja, monggo ditanyakan sesuatu. Apa? Monggo ditanya sesuatu. Bu Fatia kayaknya mau nanya. Oh enggak ya. Cuma ngantuk ternyata. Apa sudah? Gimana? Saudara. Bagaimana saudara? Ini diteruskan? Udah. Oke. Mahasiswa, lagi ada ide mau nanya apa? Mau pindah Australia biar dibayar ininya. Kalau misalkan ada depresi pun ini loh dibantu. Kalau kalian depresi pindah aja ke Australia biar di sini tidak ada yang depresi. I think Mark, because you explained it very well, there is no question whatsoever from our beloved students. I think we now could understand why people are so well taken care of in people with disability in Australia, and I hope in Indonesia the situation for disabled person also can keep up with in Australia. I think that's. Thank you very much for your explanation, presentation. Good luck with your study, and I hope that maybe you can come to Indonesia to help us with the intervention for a disabled person.
Oh, I certainly love that, and thank you very much for having me. I hope
Thank you very
all
much
your students
for
got plenty out of it.
agreeing. Thank you very much for agreeing to present your
Happy to anytime.
activity. Okay. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Diana.
Yeah.
Have a good afternoon, good evening.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Baik, nanti
dilanjutkan jam 1 untuk sesi
Okay, hi Pearl. Can you hear my voice?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Hi. Hello.
Okay, hi. How are you
I'm
today?
very good, thank you.
Okay. I believe it's around 5 in
It is
your
5 p.m.
place.
in the afternoon
Okay.
at in Melbourne. Yeah.
Actually, nice to see you again. You might not remember, but we met last year in
Oh, right, of
Monash,
course.
yeah, with Lintang.
Yes. Good to see you again then.
Okay. Okay. I'll open. Okay, kita mulai ya. Okay, yeah. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our third session today for today's seminar. Thank you again for joining us today. So we are excited to have each of you here as we dive into today's topic, which promises to be both enlightening and inspiring. And we hope this third session will provide valuable insight and foster fruitful discussion. So for this session, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. how to pronounce it? Subban? Is that
Yes,
pronounced
that's right.
correctly?
That's perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. She is an associate professor from School of Curriculum Teaching and Inclusive Education, Faculty of Education, Monash University. Today, she will be sharing her insight on curriculum policy and inclusive education practice for children with special needs. And we are very honored to have her with us today. Thank you, Prof, for giving us your time to joining us in
worries.
this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Before we begin, allow me to read your biography first. Okay, so Associate Professor Pearl Subban is an advocate for anti-racism and researchers within equity, inclusion, and social justice. She has led educational and research programs focusing on creating equitable opportunities for marginalized population who have been silenced by intersectional markers. Additionally, her international experience working across school and university education has allowed her to gain insight into global justice and injustice and collective social responsibility to address discrimination. Her research agenda examines the density of ongoing prejudice, spotlighting the complexity faced by people of color, women, and other marginalized populations around the world. Currently, Pearl is involved in a range of research and teaching initiatives focusing on navigating and negotiating intersection of disadvantage within learning and teaching context. Her goal is to build momentum for anti-racism by reconsidering power structures and provide fortitude to those who advance equity and authentic inclusion. So, okay, without further ado, please giving warm applause to our speaker today, Dr. Pearl Subban, please.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, you've got a class in front of you. That's excellent. It's very good. Is it okay if I share my screen?
Yes, please. Can you share a screen?
No worries. I will do that. Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
I'm hoping you can see my screen, Strength and Diversity.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes. All right, excellent. Well, good morning or good day to you. I think it might be in Jakarta. I'm coming to you from Melbourne. It's just past 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It's been a very warm day, but I think we are expecting some rain soon. So it's wonderful to be connecting with you today. And I know that you've had a very full day because you've had two other speakers before me, and you are exploring quite an important topic in education, I would say, and that is the inclusion of students with disabilities. And not just in classrooms, because I know some of you are not teachers, many of you probably are not teachers, but you're also thinking about how people with disabilities are integrated and involved and accommodated in mainstream settings. So wherever we are in terms of interacting with people with disabilities. My work is in inequities. So, I do a lot of work with social justice topics, like working with students with disabilities in my setting, but also I do a great deal of work with gender, particularly women and girls, and also racism. So that's probably where I'm coming from. I'm also a teacher, though, at heart, and do quite a bit of work with teacher education in Melbourne, in Victoria, and very happy to make your acquaintance today and look forward to having a long-term relationship with you. I think as people who live in society, we have a responsibility to ensure that all students, all people, have equal access to not just a strong learning environment, but also one that recognizes and respects them. So wherever we go in the world, you and I, and if you are visiting, I'm sure many of you might have traveled around the world, you know that you want to be accommodated in that space as well as you are anywhere else, and you want to be respected, and you want to be recognized and acknowledged. And students who have disabilities, people who have disabilities, want us to be acknowledging them in much the same way. So we know that inclusion is not just about taking a child with a disability, placing them in a classroom with their peers, and then we say, oh, well, the environment has been created. That's not enough. What we want is for that student to be fully participating in that space, to be valued and understood and empowered, because that's when they will feel a true sense of belonging. Recent research is showing that students with disabilities in classrooms sometimes struggle because they are placed in classrooms, but no one takes care of them. So the teacher is very busy with other students, and other students marginalize the student with disability, and it creates all kinds of challenges. So I think that when we talk about accommodating students with disabilities today, I want you to walk away with the idea that we should develop some form of empathy and compassion for an individual with a disability, but understand as well that their diversity is going to bring strength to your setting. We want students who have disabilities in classrooms to feel a strong sense of belonging, but we also want to practice true inclusion. We don't want there to be misunderstandings about how disability is meant to be accommodated. And so today I'm going to discuss with you a few issues around inclusive education, about the benefits that it will be, and that regardless of the student's ability or different ability, all have the opportunity to thrive and to prosper in a classroom. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let me get ahead with that. Let's see. I seem to have lost my space here. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to be talking to you about, hang on. Here we go. Yeah, I'll come back to that slide. All right. So I don't know whether too many of you are drivers. I'm a driver. and I've been driving for many years. But if you have not ever driven, think about what it might be to learn how to drive. And if you've ever learned how to drive, you know that you have to drive on a challenging road. You can't drive on an easy road, because it's the challenging roads that turn you into a good driver. If you had an easy road like the one on the right-hand side, then you're not going to become a very good driver. You have to face the traffic jam on the left-hand side. And you might think, what? Look at that traffic jam. It's terrible. No one should be driving there. But you will gain so much confidence as a driver, and you may not know it in the moment because it'll be terrifying. But just think about having to navigate through that space. This is what attempts at inclusion can do for people with disabilities. It will strengthen our societies. We will become better for it. We will gain confidence. So I'm saying to you that students with disabilities should participate fully. It's almost like walking, or not walking, sorry, driving through that intersection. Walking would also be quite a difficult experience. in the process of doing that, you're going to develop skills. You're going to understand what it's like for that person with the disability to solve problems, how they develop resiliency, and how they develop their own access to education. So you learn how people thrive. Now, remember, like I said, driving on those difficult roads are what's going to make you better. In fact, they say, even in life, I mean, many of you are psychology students anyway, so you know this, that if you undertake a hard situation, it's a tough situation, it's actually going to make you better as a person because you are developing skills as a human being to tackle pretty difficult issues. The person who's always had it soft and someone who's always had it easy actually is denied of those strengthening skills. So we need to face challenges. And as educators and as people, this is what we're needing to explore every day, a traffic jam. And that's what it is. So I think as well that when we talk about learning and growing and succeeding with students with disabilities, we understand that that difficult road is what we need to tackle because you need tools, you need resources, you need support to navigate through that busy intersection. All right. So I'm going to obviously speak to you a great deal about inclusion today, but I did a little bit of a mapping search today and just added this idea. I want you to consider the power of diversity in your community. All right. So we live in different communities, but very similar. I was born and grew up in South Africa, so a country that is very different from the one I live in now. And I know that people from different backgrounds and different cultures and abilities are in the same schools. They learn in the same spaces, but we are learning as a country in South Africa. I've been living in Australia for almost 30 years, so it's a long time. But in South Africa, to recognize everyone's unique contribution. And I think inclusive education allows us to learn from each other and from our students. When students from diverse backgrounds and abilities share a classroom, they gain very valuable lessons in empathy, patience, and understanding. These are skills that go beyond academic knowledge. So you're not just teaching content to them. The other thing that I found as well, and this is probably linking a lot to what I do as a researcher, is that female students with disabilities, in particular, often face greater challenges because of social stereotypes and stigma. And this is common across the world. So girls seem to have a tougher role when it comes to disability than boys do. So that kind of, it will sharpen what you're thinking as well. By focusing on inclusive practices, therefore, we are not only going to support students, but we're going to change those negative stereotypes and those perceptions about disability, especially for vulnerable young women who are most at risk. All right. So I think here, let's think about the positive impact of diversity on our society. We want to support students with disabilities by creating a more unified and compassionate community in our classrooms. And this is what I'm thinking about. All right. So keep in mind that every student has to participate fully for us to build this inclusive space. All right. So I know that you're all in different areas, and I just want to ask you a few questions as we go. So I want you to think about this question in front of you. In what ways can promoting diversity and enabling students with disabilities result in a more unified and inclusive society? Now, I don't know whether you're in front of a computer because everyone's turned off their cameras, but I'll just bring the computer back to me and open the chat. Maybe if you can, if you don't, it's fine. I'm not sure where my chat is gone. There it is. Okay. So I'm going to put my chat in here just to see your answers. But if you can, and you have a computer in front of you, if not, have a think about it. Just think, in what ways can promoting diversity and enabling students with disabilities create this more unified and inclusive society? So we are thinking about what's the best way that we can support diversity and foster environments where everyone is feeling valued. So remember, every child, every individual comes with a unique contribution. And we're thinking about the fact that students with disabilities tend to support, or we tend to support, sorry, I got distracted because I'm watching the chat. this doesn't, when we support students with disabilities in classrooms, it doesn't just support the student with a disability, it supports everyone. So everyone is benefiting from that. Students with disabilities can share their perspectives and their talents, and in so doing, it's going to change the way that they experience life and the way that we experience life being so-called without disabilities. So look, I would have loved to have heard your thoughts, but I know that the chat is probably a challenge when it's a space like this. That's okay, but maybe we can connect at some other time. But take a moment to think about it. Think about how you've seen or experienced people with disabilities in your societies and in your spaces. We want to build on these ideas, remember, and we want to explore ways in which we can support people with disabilities so that we turn into a stronger, more cohesive society. All right, let's keep going since there's no space for the chat. Doesn't matter. All right, so I have a very good relationship with colleagues of mine who live in Jakarta from BINUS University, and I'm not sure whether anyone knows about that. I think there's a campus, there's several campuses across Java as well. But I was there earlier this year in May, and we were talking about this Indonesian Cultural Foundation of Gotong Royong, which essentially means mutual cooperation, as you know. And for me, this became such a powerful principle that emphasizes our collective responsibility for students with disabilities. This cultural value, as you know, collective responsibility, is not just about helping people, but it's about working together to ensure that everyone experiences that sense of belonging and everyone feels that sense of value. It's your cultural value. In South Africa, we have something called Ubuntu, which means very similar things to Gotong Royong, which is the idea of working together. I can only call myself a person if I assist somebody else to become a person. So essentially, Ubuntu means I am because you are. So it's the same thing. We are creating these nurturing and inclusive environments for all our students, including those students with disabilities. The other thing that I found, which was really, really good about Gotong Royong, is the idea of the family. I know that in Indonesia, family engagement is critical. In fact, that's one of the things that impressed me the most, because I think family is such an important part of everything. I spoke to one of the students at the university, and she said she won't be able to leave Indonesia ever because she can't leave her family. And therefore, when we think about students with disabilities, their families are their biggest advocates. So using this idea, it means everyone comes together to ensure that the student with disabilities receives the respect and the resources they need to thrive. Gotong Royong means for me this interconnected support system that doesn't just benefit the student with the disability, but it enriches everyone. We are all becoming more empathetic and more compassionate and more understanding as well. So I think embedding cultural practice into our everyday life reinforces the idea that this is a shared responsibility. Everyone participates. So, in that community that I'm speaking about, it could be teachers, parents, the students, community members, and so on. Because remember, we are building this foundation to ensure that no student is left behind. All right. So it means let's support everyone to strengthen our communities. Okay. One of the things that becomes a bit of a challenge when we talk about disabilities, though, and it's something good to think about when you're considering inclusion, is to think about what you mean by a disability. Now, most of the pictures that I'm using are they are derived from Canva, because I used Canva to do my slides today. But at the same time, it's people with visible disabilities, because the disability is most apparent. So you'll see wheelchairs and you'll see, people with disability that's very obvious. But remember, there are many people who have sensory disabilities, cognitive disabilities, mental health conditions, and every one of these people face unique challenges. By recognizing that diversity within disability, we can better understand how different environments can either empower or disable a person. So I'm going to speak to you in a moment about the social and medical model of disability, just to move it along. But one of the key aspects of inclusion is to notice the severity of the disability, because in order to accommodate the student, we need to know what we need to do. So let's say if this person who's, it's an animated idea, but if they were at our schools or in our workplaces, we would need to create ramps because they wouldn't be able to climb stairs. Ramps would be much easier for wheelchairs and so on. If someone was not able to see, then we would have to create braille, so they could feel their way because of low vision. If someone has a sensory disability, then we might find quiet places where they can work by themselves. So that accessibility is something that we are constantly thinking about as educators and as people. Remember though, if an institution does not have accessible environments, they will create obstacles for the student, and their needs will not be considered in the classroom. Therefore, those students with disabilities are going to be very limited. They won't do well. They might have great ability, but we won't be able to tap into any of those because we would have limited their participation. So I think as a group, if we walk away from this, we need to think, how can we make our spaces, our classrooms, genuinely inclusive by fostering these environments that empower all students to learn and grow and thrive. And in so doing, we are not just supporting the student with a disability. Remember, we are creating these environments where everyone is accommodated, everyone adapts, and everyone is welcome. So it's a really good space for us to be thinking about. But like I said, I just use the obvious ones because of being dictated to in that way. All right, you might have seen this before, and you might have heard maybe a previous speaker talk about it, but there are many models of disability, but I'm just going to show you two. The first one is the medical model, which is on the top diagram, and the second one is the social model. The medical model, as you can see through the arrows, are pointing at the person. It holds the person responsible for their disability. The social model, by contrast, looks at the environment. So in other words, how can we best support students with disabilities, looking at either the medical or the social model? More recently, we have distinguished the two and realized that the medical model is reductive. The medical model views disability as a problem. It's located inside the individual. And according to this model, disabilities are defined by impairments and limitations, where a student can't do certain things, they don't have the mental functioning, they cannot physically access something. So in this framework, we look at the person and we think we need to fix them. We need to do something to them so they can adapt and become normal. But that's not the case. When you look at the social model, we don't see the problem within the person. We see the problem being social barriers in the environment that they are in. Those social barriers could be attitudes, like the ones I told you about before. It could be barriers, something that restricts their access to equal opportunities. So, for example, again, the student with the wheelchair in the picture, we wouldn't consider that person disabled if we were looking at them just by their impairment. We would say that we need to be saying that that person is disabled because we don't have ramps, we don't have accessible classrooms, we don't have policies that can allow them to participate fully. That's a social model. So you need to know this distinction, and I'm sure someone else might have referenced this too, because it changes the way we approach inclusion. So I don't use a lot of public transport, but I know that the buses in Australia, for example, have ramps. Buses have ramps so that if someone with a wheelchair is getting on, the bus actually has the capacity to accommodate a wheelchair. By stopping and taking care of this person, that means that they are accommodating the person using this social model, because a barrier has been removed. Usually with a bus, you've got to step up, I take 2 steps up before you get into the bus. But in this case, the ramp is allowing the person to then get into the bus without problems. It's become more accessible. That person then can engage in society fully. So the more we think about the social model, the more we emphasize the fact that we too are responsible, collectively responsible, to foster inclusion where all students are valued and supported. So I hope that's kind of fixing some of the ideas as we think about it. All right. So just another quick element here to reinforce the social model of disability. The social model sees disability as a result of interactions between people who live with impairments, like the person in the wheelchair, and then the environment, which sometimes is totally inaccessible. So if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, you can see that's totally inaccessible. The person is standing in front of a stairway and they can't get up the stairs in a wheelchair. But if you look at the one on the right, you can see that that's an accessible environment, which is respecting all individuals. And as a result, it's going to allow the person with a disability to access that space in the same way that other people can as well. So the social model of disability, as I said earlier, is now recognized as a way to view and address disability. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which is sometimes called the CRPD, marks the official paradigm shift in attitudes towards people with disability and approaches with disability concerns using the social model. So remember, in this space, we don't see people as being kind of objects. They don't deserve our pity. They don't deserve charity. But what they do deserve is our respect and our care and compassion so that they too can enter society and have the ability to take advantage of everything that society has to offer. All right. So often I'm using these physical disabilities, like I said, because it's very easy to see the disability. Like if I showed you someone with a hearing impairment, or even sometimes with a sight impairment, you might not be able to see it just by looking at their faces. So that's why we are referring to it so much as physical disability as well. But you can transfer the skill to other places as well. All right. The element that I'm going to be focusing on here is UNESCO's definition of inclusion, which is critical for classrooms because it values diversity. So UNESCO's definition, if I can break it down for you, is on looking at the barriers. So it says, accommodate all learners. That means all the barriers that could face a child when they come into a classroom should be removed. You can't look at education and say one size is fitting all, and we teach using one method, we teach using one textbook, we teach using one strategy for assessment. That means not everyone can participate fully. We have to value their diversity, number two. By valuing diversity, we create a richer, more dynamic learning environment that helps students appreciate and respect differences. Number three is promoting equity. That is fundamental. Equity goes beyond equality. Equity and equality are two very different terms. If you looked at this online, you will see that there's vast differences between them. Equity is about ensuring that every child has access to resources and opportunities. That's very important for students with disabilities, or for that matter, anyone who is facing a disadvantage. It means acknowledging and addressing the unique challenges that some students would face. And the last one is to build a supportive and learning community to create a vision for that child. So it's not just something that teachers do, it's something that society does, all of us, to create spaces for students and their families, ensuring that when we work together, we foster a culture of inclusion and mutual support, and we create this learning environment where all students are feeling safe and valued and encouraged to reach their full potential. So just as we round off this section here, when we think about inclusive education, let's finish off with sometimes what is called the challenges when we think about inclusive education. I'm speaking about them, about people with disabilities in school settings because I work in education. But if you are in another context and you are undertaking support for a child with a disability or an adult with that disability, you are merely going to transfer some of that into what you are doing as well. So many of us want to be inclusive, but we don't feel equipped to support anyone with a diverse need. So any preparation program is going to help. In this case, I'm talking about teachers because the needs in a classroom can be so very different. Sometimes we say we don't have resources, and that's problematic because we think, oh, this requires very specialized knowledge and it requires assistive technology and it needs support staff. But remember, you don't really need that as much as you need an attitudinal shift, because students with disabilities just want to feel like they belong. But let's not wait for the resources to come through. We can still offer critical support, because we don't have to hinder learning by not allowing a child to belong. In a school setting, I also talk about an inflexible curriculum, because the traditional curriculum is often designed with a kind of typical student in mind. Like if I think about now, I am speaking to you, I'm lecturing in a way. There's no interaction between the two of us. There's no differentiation. The student with a disability is definitely going to require differentiation. So we need to be thinking about alternative ways so that all students feel the flexibility of a curriculum. And then finally, remember, we want parents to be involved. Families are the biggest advocates of their children. Not all parents are going to feel empowered to speak to, but remember, if they participate with you, there is active support, not just for the home, but for society. So sometimes you might find that, there might be language barriers, there might be socioeconomic challenges, there might be limited awareness of what the disability constitutes, but this is where we come in. We are from the higher education setting, and we will need to find ways to encourage and support family involvement. That partnership is important, so very important, between the educators and their families. And like I said, I'm speaking about it as an educator, but you apply that to your setting as well. So I think addressing these challenges will allow us to then address something much larger. We can tackle the obstacles if we are fixed on the idea that we want a truly inclusive environment. If we are to look at UNESCO's definition of inclusive education for curriculum, we want to make sure that every child has access to the classroom. I was speaking to another PhD student, not another, a PhD student from Indonesia. She's from Malang, and she was telling me about the fact that soft skills are so important in Indonesia at the moment. Not that it is not required around the world. It's become an essential element for everyone to survive these days. But it's very important for us to get ahead in the global classroom, knowing these things. So I think if you look at this picture of this person who's in a wheelchair and wearing these virtual reality glasses, this is a way of teaching, and it's being used nowadays. Maybe not in every classroom, because it's varied nowadays, and that those things cost a great deal of money. But it is a flexible and adaptable curriculum, because it's meeting a diverse need. And this person is probably in a wheelchair for a reason and cannot have access to other things in the way that other people can. And therefore, it allows them to interact with the world in that way. We know that professional development is important as well. In order to foster our own knowledge, we need to be trained, we need to be prepared, we need to be developed so that we can support people who have very diverse needs. The technology that I was referring to here, and I'm just looking at that on my left here because I've got another screen that's got all the information there, and then I've got my camera on the side. So I think assistive technologies and learning aids can also be very useful. They can become essential tools in supporting people with disabilities, whether it's through some form of specialized software or a hearing device or any other adaptive tool. Technologies ensure that all students can access and engage with the curriculum in very meaningful ways. So I think, we look at it as a fabulous picture as well. I'm sure many of you might have tried the virtual reality headset as well. It's quite an experience. You feel like you are in the space. So, expensive stuff though. But remember, those environments are where people are going to feel like they are being valued and they are being accepted and they are being encouraged to thrive and to promote themselves. As well, I mentioned community and family involvement, so we won't mention that again, but we want some policies to support people with disabilities. Inclusive education can only be implemented with success if we have clear guidelines, resources, and systems to monitor progress and ensure that all children are being fully accommodated. So when we talk about disability, think about people that you know with disabilities. One of the best studies that are done in this space is that if you want to know what people with disabilities really feel like, you have to have a person with a disability in your inner circle. So you become so much better off knowing these things because you understand the effort involved for them and the effort involved for you. So people with disabilities possess a wide range of skills. You only come to know that when you have them in your inside circle. You know, your intimate circle means the people that you trust and the people who are around you all the time. So if you really want to know what this feels like, you have to make friends with someone who has a disability. And here, like I said, I'm using physical disability, but as we know, we have disabilities across the board that cannot be seen, invisible disabilities. So I'm sure you might have heard of someone called Helen Keller, and she was a really famous world personality. She's dead now, but she overcame both blindness and deafness to become a renowned author and activist. So if you don't know, just Google her, Helen Keller. Stephen Hawking is another one. Some of you might have heard about him. Very common. He must have also died now. Famous movie made about his life was called The Theory of Everything. Remarkable individual because he was living with a debilitating disease which took away every form except his mind, and he was confined to a wheelchair, could do nothing, but somehow made such a huge contribution to physics. So you can see disability is not really a hindrance to intelligence and contribution. These two people are prime examples of how disability does not have to limit potential. So very important. Sometimes when a person is faced with a challenge, they actually do better, which is very interesting. So we have advancements in technologies, inclusive practices that have opened across the world, and there's speech recognition software. AI is on the board nowadays. People with disabilities have prosthetic legs. People are participating in every form. So we know that this is a really important part. Just think about how you are understanding disability from your perspective. So don't think about it just in terms of obstacles. Think about the contribution that they are making and how they can lead those creative solutions in order for us to have a more equitable environment. Disability do not define a person's ability or potential. If anything, they should shape the path differently. It's our responsibility as a society to create that accessibility. All right, quick summary here before I move on to the next part, which is moving on. The summary of why we should support inclusive education, I just want to touch on those four. So that's all, and then we can move on. So the first one is fostering equity and social justice, which I think is very important as to why we need to consider accommodating disability. The second is mutual cooperation, which is an Indonesian cultural value, like I said, gotong royong, which you know much more about than I do. I'm probably even pronouncing it wrong, but anyhow. Third one, encouraging a sense of belonging and community. And finally, building future-ready skills and empathy in all students. So those are kind of the things that I covered earlier. And remember, I'm using pictures of physical disability so that you can see it. But there are many students, many people in the world who don't have visible disabilities. We sometimes call them invisible disabilities. Like an autism diagnosis can be invisible, hearing impairment, any sensory or cognitive impairment may not be visible. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So we, as a society, have to become more aware of that as well. All right, so we don't have opportunities here to think about this together because I know we can't use the chat because you are listening, but we've got to think about how do we do this. So now we've considered the definition and the values and the potential barriers. What do you think we can do to facilitate this inclusive education that we're talking about? So I'm going to quickly go through 5 strategies, only 5, quickly, until we get to the end, and then give you a chance to ask me some questions. So I think number 1 is to remove physical, social, and instructional barriers. So we want every person to thrive. We want every person to feel a sense of belonging. Let's remove the obstacles. Physical obstacles can be things like a narrow doorway, like the steps we talked about earlier, furniture that is inaccessible, a classroom layout that might make it difficult for the student to move their wheelchairs or something like that. So mostly physical barriers would apply to students with physical disabilities. But then let's think about social barriers as well. Social barriers will involve those interpersonal challenges that students or people might face. Sometimes students with disabilities are bullied and they are excluded A child can have a birthday party on the weekend at home and invite everyone and leave the child with a disability, which is probably going to make them feel really bad. So let's help to overcome those social barriers to foster a culture of acceptance, respect, and empathy. And then finally, of course, we've got instructional barriers. I speak about this again because I'm a teacher educator, but teaching methods and materials and assessments that are used in the classroom should not be singular. Traditional methods, as we do, I grew up in a very traditional classroom setting, came from a country that was like that, but I know that that form of teaching may not always be accessible to students with very diverse learning needs. So we have to remove the barriers, and teachers should be adopting more differentiation in their teaching strategies, using some of the assistive technologies we talked about earlier, and maybe just offering alternative forms of assessment. So let's think about 3 barriers: physical, social, and instructional, so that we create spaces where every student feels valued and supported. Strategy number 2. I think one of the most important steps in creating inclusive classrooms is for teachers to become equipped. Now, I know you're probably not a teacher, but support the teachers who are doing this. Teachers are at the heart of inclusive education, and they are going to meet the diverse needs of all the students that they are accommodating. So some people have received formal training and others have not. Some may feel very unsure about accommodating students with disabilities, and they don't have confidence, so that creates a bit of a barrier. They don't teach effectively as a result. This is where teacher training and professional development comes in. So it's really important to provide teachers with ongoing opportunities to develop their expertise in inclusive teaching strategies, whether it's with the instruction or with technology or the environment. Everything contributes to that belonging and that integration that we talk about. So students must be accommodated when teachers feel prepared and when they are confident. It's going to benefit the student with a disability, but every other student is going to be enriched in the process. Remember, we send very strong messages to the world when we do something that's social. So if you watch TikTok and you watch YouTube shorts and so on, you know that social experiments often happen on the street, where you have like someone who's blind and they are walking and they touch someone's hand as they are walking. Lots of people will flinch, they don't want the person to touch them and they move away, and the cameraman is there to catch all that. But if we change the way that our societies think, and when the person is walking and they reach out for you to allow the person to hold your hand while it's walking, and you think, oh no, that won't happen to me. But we know this happens to us and to every other person in the world all the time. So that kind of development is what happens in society to change the experience for the person with the disability. So that is strategy 2. Strategy number 3. This is probably one of the things that I talk about a lot when I teach, but it's about creating a collaborative approach. And one of the papers that I'm writing at the moment is dealing with that value system about creating a sustainable, inclusive education environment, not in isolation. In fact, we are, as human beings, the only way that we can function as people is if we function with other people. Nobody functions alone. Sometimes we like to be alone for a while. Many of us like working alone, but eventually you want the group. You want your parents, or you want your partner, or you want your family, your brothers and sisters around you, because we gain from being together. And I think this collaborative approach also applies to our societies and our classrooms as well. Teachers will bring a lot of knowledge of curriculum and classroom management through very specialized understanding. But remember, anybody else can come in and contribute very personally so that they turn that experience for the child in quite a significant way. Every community member, including a local organization, even businesses, can support, maybe through mentorship or paying for an educational experience or supporting a child through a resource. We talked earlier about mutual cooperation. This aligns so beautifully to what we talk about here, which is this collaborative strategy. So I think cultural values are going to be important, but it's also important to understand that when communities come together, they can create very, very inclusive spaces for all students, especially those with disabilities. So we can build very strong support systems that ensure that students with disabilities are not only just accommodated, but actively empowered to succeed in the classroom and beyond. All right, coming to an end, don't worry, we're almost there. All right. So I'm not saying this again, but you know how important it is to empower the family. Parents want their children to be accommodated. They know the needs of their child, so accommodate that. One of the things that I found is a bit of a barrier for us at the moment, because Australia is very multicultural, the cultural considerations, because every family comes with its very unique cultural background, and recognizing and respecting those differences just builds a stronger, more trusting relationships. So that's an important element there. Also thinking about assistive technology, which I talked about earlier, we are trying a few things in our spaces at the moment, and I'm just mentioning it to you because you might have heard about this as well. But the fourth strategy is always to think about what can we do to support the child with the disability. So things like screen readers and speech-to-text software, which we use as part of AI nowadays, is so good. Using an audio book, using speech recognition software, using any form of assistive technology will provide the kind of support that the child needs to overcome their specific challenge. So remember, if they learn in a traditional environment, it's probably going to create barriers. Think about the person with a wheelchair and the steps. So someone once said they saw this meme on the internet that you can't teach a fish to excel by teaching it how to climb a tree. The fish is going to excel if it's placed in water. But let's say an animal that climbs, like a monkey, for example, would probably be able to very quickly climb up a tree because it has the capacity to do that. So very different. So we might want to think about students who have those very specific needs and require very specialized support, and how we can best accommodate that. So in the context of an Indonesian school, for example, it's about understanding what tools are required, what are the challenges that we need to address, and how can we then create spaces where things like cost and training and internet infrastructure can be addressed through that. So I think it's very important to identify some of those local resources and collaborate with stakeholders in order to get those done. All right, so I speak a bit about assistive technology because I think in the modern age, you know, with all the stuff that we do, it's probably creating a really accessible space, and it allows every student to participate and be successful because we have so much technology at our disposal at the moment. And then coming to peer support programs. So we've got peer support programs that are incredibly powerful strategies. Students with disabilities and people with disabilities enjoy the company of other people. So if their peers get in and help them, it enriches the learning experience for them because their classmates are getting involved. So another child can assist a student with disability in understanding some of the material through talking to them one-on-one, providing emotional and social support. You could have peer support programs encouraging students to develop social skills. Like I said earlier, patience, communication, and problem solving. Think about that intersection that is completely jammed and someone is navigating through that. We learn skills when we are in those environments. Remember as well, the student with a disability wants to feel that sense of belonging. They want to know others care for them. Others feel that they are valued and they feel respected. So this strategy aligns with that idea of collective responsibility as well, mutual cooperation, collective support. So go back to the cultural values and principles that I talked about earlier. It's working together for the common good of every student, and therefore every child becomes a natural fit in the classroom. So peer support will also reduce isolation for the child with a disability. It will just add to that inclusive school culture. Everyone's working together, supporting one another, and students learn that everyone has something valuable to say. So it's an effective way to create empathy and collaboration and this very strong sense of community. All right, I'm coming to an end. All right, so I hope that it has been useful for you. I know that I spoke largely from a teaching perspective, but I know that you are going to translate some of those skills into the spaces that you are as well. All right, I thank you for listening, and I'm going to take some questions if you have any. We've explored a number of strategies that are essential for creating an environment where all students, regardless of their environment, create a culture of empathy, respect, and shared responsibility. And I think teaching students with disabilities requires us to think very critically about our own approaches to teaching, ensuring that we are actively supporting all learners and recognizing their unique strengths and needs. I said many of you are not educators, but you are participants in society. We have the power to make a significant impact on the lives of people with disabilities. We collaborate together with their families, with our communities, with staff, and by providing ongoing professional development to everyone involved, we can enhance our own skills and build more inclusive education systems and inclusive spaces as well. So just a reminder, as we are moving forward, we need to commit to adopting inclusive practices, advocate for the resources that we need, and then give every child, every person with a disability, the space that they deserve, one where potential is recognized and they are supported. So I hope that was valuable, and I thank you for your attention. I hope you feel a bit inspired. I know you've had a very long day listening to lots of speakers, but I hope that there's a little bit of inspiration here to continue working towards a more inclusive and supportive experience for all people with disabilities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Pro. Such an insightful material. It's interesting that you mentioned gotong royong, but unfortunately, gotong royong is also a value that most of students use during exams. So that it's a very wrong value that apply during exam. Okay, now we move to a question and answer section. Please raise your hand. Teman-teman, ada yang mau, I'm gonna ask them in Indonesia. Teman-teman silahkan kalau ada yang mau bertanya kepada materi kita siang ini, silahkan angkat tangan. Yang di chat boleh, yang di ruangan ini juga boleh. Okay, we have one. Okay.
I think there's a question in the chat though.
Yes. Someone is raising a hand in the room.
Sure.
Ask her first. Okay, please.
Mention
the name. Yes.
Just to make sure, is my voice clear enough?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Grace. I'm currently a third-year student, and I work at the Center for Disabled Services here in Universitas Brawijaya. I would like to touch on the topic of ableism. Ableism is essentially a way of thinking that devalues and discriminates against people with disabilities. And a particular issue that I see that's prevalent in many of my disabled peers is internalized ableism. It's when they hold this heavy criticism and unhealthy perception of themselves for being a person with disability. Now, we know that negative self-perception widely affects their self-esteem, academic performance, and mental health. Now, my question is, how do we collectively as a society, how can we tackle this problem? And maybe you can also share your personal experience that's related with this problem in the classroom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Grace. That's an excellent question. Very good. I think ableism is something that we need to tackle as a society. It does create discrimination for people with disabilities because, like you said, there's this internalized ableism. Well done. It's a perfect way of saying it. It's created a few social stigmas. It's created labeling, and even the person with a disability wants to advance so that they become able. And it's difficult to convince them that they are equipped within themselves. And so I think that's what led to the negative perceptions, and lots of people are thinking about, what's the way that we can become more able? What's the way that we can do what able-bodied people do? And ableism is one of those intersections that we talk about in critical theory as well. Two ways to address it, and two ways that I've addressed it in my own spaces as well. The first is through representation. So if you look at advertising, let's say advertising that's being done, whether it's within the university setting where I work or even within the social construct that's working within Australia, representation of people with disabilities in public is important. So they need to be on posters. They need to be like, if there's a clothes shop that's advertising the style, it should be a person in a wheelchair can wear it just as well as someone who's standing up. If you think about the iPhone, when you're advertising for the iPhone, a person with a disability can be in the advertisement as well. And as a result, you're changing the way that you view disability. That it's not, you don't have to be able in order to participate. You can have a disability and the accessibility is better because these advertisers have taken them off. We live in this world that is so influenced by social media. So I think one of the ways to actually address that would be to represent people with disabilities on those advertisements. And I've seen it. So, and I know it shifts attitudes as well. The second one is one that I touched on as well, is on engagement. So if you are interacting with people with disability, the more that you interact with them, the less likely those ableist labels are going to take hold, because everyone's going to be valued for what they contribute. So remember, everyone's got a unique contribution. Everyone contributes in a different way. And so the engagement with the person with a disability is going to be vital in that space. So, I did a study on racism, which is a little bit different, but same skill is involved there as well. And I did it to a group of teachers, largely white teachers in Australia. And I said, how many of you have a person of color in your friendship circle? Stand up. And out of the 30 people, only 2 stood up, because the others, they're not close friends. We know them, but we don't invite them to our homes and they don't interact with us. That's telling. You can't say that you're not racist unless you do that. So it's the same with a person with a disability. You unpack that by saying, I have a close friend with a disability and I understand what it's like. And I see that person bringing to the table their own contribution, the things they do really well and the things that we can cultivate for them to do as well. So long answer there, but 2 ways: representation and engagement.
Okay, there is a question on the Zoom chat. How do the social and medical models of disability differ in their approach to understanding and addressing the needs of individuals with disability, and what are the implications of each model for policymaking and inclusive practice in society? Thank you.
That's also a really good question, Najwa. That's a question for policymakers. We generally don't use the medical model as much. Let's talk about the medical model first. The medical model sees the fault in the person. So the person is the one with the problem. And if you remember that diagram that I showed you earlier, all the arrows are pointing at the person. It's not meant to be like that, because society is meant to shift their attitudes in order to accommodate the person better. So the medical model uses a diagnosis, like a child with autism, for example, has the autistic label, and then people think that that person can't interact in the same way as other children can. And the label is medical, and it prevents the child from being accommodated and being valued and being respected. I'm not saying labels are not important. I'm someone who actually thinks it's better to know, but at the same time, what you do with it after that is also important. The social model is the one that we are becoming more embracing of. It's the one that UNESCO is now using in order to write up their global disability policies. And it's the one that most countries use in order to develop their inclusive policies. So if I had to think about where I am, the social model is now deciding whether we as a society need to change, whether the person with a disability has to change. The person with a disability is not at fault. Society needs to change. Society needs to become a little bit more prepared in order to accommodate the person with a disability. So we are veering, and some countries are already there, looking at the social model, and we are completely getting rid of the medical. Not getting rid of it to the point, like I said, where we don't need it. It has a place. I think knowing is important, but the label should not be something that turns into a stigma. We come to know something because we want to assist, not because we tag the label on and say, oh, this is the person, and you see the disability first and the person second. Social models always prioritize the person. It's person first, disability second. So we are changing our policies to accommodate the person and less the disability. So, our societies need to change. We're on our way there. We'll never get there because we are constantly changing. But we know that the social model is going to help us to become more productive and more accessible as a society as well. Thank you.
Ada lagi yang mau bertanya? Silahkan, teman-teman. Ngantuk ya? Biar nggak ngantuk nanya. Ayo. Gak apa-apa pakai bahasa Indonesia, nanti saya bantu untuk nerjemahin kalau saya nggak salah. Silahkan, nggak apa-apa, udah nggak usah takut, nggak ada yang judging kalian mau pakai bahasa apa. Silahkan. Ada?
It's been a very long day.
Yeah. They're probably shy to ask.
Oh, yes, 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 I
English
know.
probably, I'm not sure. And I'll be the one to ask question. Pearl, you mentioned about peer support programs in one of the strategy earlier. How is that specifically? I mean, does that just raising awareness to the student that they have a, disability peer group, or teaching them specifically about some program or included them in curriculum, or how to encourage peer support program in, let's say, at school and inclusive
I think
education?
peer support is vital. Every child wants to have friends. And a colleague of mine in our faculty who's done a lot of research with peer groups, the student with the disability often minds their disability most when it acts as a hindrance to having friends. They want to have friends. Because remember, we are human beings at the end of the day. We want other human beings around us. They want to be invited to birthday parties. They want to enjoy their friends. They want to share lunches. They want to do those things. But sometimes a student with a disability is left out, and they're at home, and the other children are invited out and so on. And so I think the peer support program is a facilitating program that's going to almost ask students to be together. So the child is going to enjoy the company of another child. They're going to be sitting together. The other child might be helping them out with homework or teaching them a new concept, but they are not going to feel as isolated. It's also going to be very good for that peer who's supporting the child with a disability, because they are learning so much. They're learning about how to accommodate the difference. They're learning about how to be patient, how to be compassionate and understanding. So, everyone's going to benefit in this regard. And it's not a load that must be carried by one student, unless that student is, very keen. But often we want it to be something that's accommodated across the classroom. So lots of students get involved. We are a community, remember what I said, collectively responsible as well. And everybody gets involved and everyone supports the students. I think the peer group is absolutely vital to help students with disabilities. They love the company of their friends. That sense of belonging and feeling accepted is so very important.
But in order to do that, then we need like inclusive environment, teaching support, teacher support, correct? And of course, parents.
Yeah, for sure.
Because sometimes the parents that make the student feel isolated, like they said, probably do not play with that kid. He's or she different.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And I think that's where we come together as a community and we contribute together, because if we think about it, changing attitudes, especially the parents who might be, who might have resistant attitudes, they are going to influence their children, and the children are going to come into the class and react the way the parents have been speaking. So if we can change parents' attitudes as well, that's important too. So I haven't been in school teaching for many years, but I started life as a school teacher. And I remember having workshops for parents to say, come to the school, we'll show you how to, better accommodate a child with a disability if you are inviting them to a birthday party. like a child in a wheelchair, what's the best way to do that? So that everybody got an invitation, and it wasn't just, regarded as someone who was just part of that able group, in other words. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Pro. Any other questions? Bona mungkin. Ini anak-anak nggak ada yang nanya. Yang lain ada yang mau tanya? Ayo. Ya, oke, silahkan. Mas Erik. Siapa ya? Ada yang nanya? Oh, ini. Oke, 1, 2, gantian ya. Sebutkan nama ya, jangan lupa.
My name is Teja, and I'm from psychology major.
Yes.
Yeah. As far as I know, the problem in Indonesia is that this inclusive curriculum is only implemented in several schools, mostly private schools compared to public schools that are directly managed by the government. My question is, does something similar happen in other parts of the world? And what are the obstacles that make these problems happen? Thank you.
Oh, Teja, thank you for that question. That is a really good question. I think Indonesia is on the way though, because there's a new government policy on inclusive education that's coming in, and it's going to move inclusive education not just from into the private school, but into the public schools as well. But you're right. The bottom line is money. All of us need money. So if schools had money, they would accommodate students with disabilities much better. So I think the private schools are able to do it because they are funded by the money they receive, and the public schools are not as quick because there isn't enough money. So I like I said to you earlier, I was born and grew up in South Africa, and it's not a rich country. They get by, but they're not a rich country. And many of the public schools do not practice inclusive education. It's in the policy. They have inclusive education policies since early 2000s, but it hasn't translated well into classrooms because there isn't enough money to have resources, to build ramps, nothing like that. So it's problematic in that regard. So you're right. Some areas in the world are very strong because there's money. Like if I think about policies in the United States, or you think about policies in the UK, even in Australia, very, very strong because there's money. The government has money to support it. But in some other parts of the world, it's lagging a little bit. I have a PhD student from the Philippines, and he talks about the same issues, that the public schools in the Philippines don't have enough money to practice inclusive education. So they can't afford to build ramps, they can't afford support staff, definitely no assistive technology. So it translates into a lack of accommodation as a result. But then, if we said that and we said, oh, we don't have money and therefore we can't do this, that's one thing. Money is one thing. But our attitudes do not have to be determined by money. We can have positive attitudes without having lots of money to support that. So I don't think in that part, we can say, oh, that's a cop-out. We can say we don't have money and therefore we can't practice inclusion. We can practice inclusion with the things that don't cost money, like changing the way that we see disability. So adopting the social model. The social model, remember, is the person does not have a disability. Society has a disability in a way. So, change the attitude, doesn't cost a thing. And then maybe in time, money will be provided in order to accommodate students with disabilities in classrooms. So yes, long answer there again. For the public school system and the private school system, it's the same around the world. Nothing changes. There are many private schools in Australia as well, which have a lot of money, and they're better equipped to accommodate students with disabilities.
Okay.
I hope that
Jawab ya,
answers
Teja.
your question, Taija.
Ada lagi tadi Mas Erik yang nah. Ya, jadi masalahnya cuan ya.
Yes. Thank you, Per, for the very insightful topics when we talk about inclusivity. But my question is, when we talk about the social model, limited accessibility to the public infrastructure in Indonesia, and how it impacts the daily lives of people with disabilities. Like for the examples, the law of concern of how important tactile paving for people with low vision, and how does this differ from the accessibility standards in Australia itself? Can you share some of your experience with the facilities provided by the government, and what do you think about the importance for the inclusivity within the disabilities? Thank you.
That's a very good question as well. Thank you very much. We've had some lovely questions. In Australia, the social model of disability determines policy, and everything is around the social model. So I mentioned earlier that even public transport accommodates people with physical disability. So, it changes. So like I saw this, like I said, don't use public transport myself that much because of just having different access to work. But sometimes the ramps change to accommodate a wheelchair. So it's really well done. And so that's a social model of disability. The building that I'm working in has doors that open, rather than like they're open on the side rather than opening to the front so that a wheelchair can enter. So in the past, we used to have, I'm pretty sure you have that in Indonesia as well, those rotating doors, which is such a nightmare anyway. But that rotating doors doesn't allow a wheelchair. It can even create a problem for a child with autism. So we've taken off all those doors and replaced them instead using the opening, like it's an automatically opening door, and then a wheelchair wider door can pass through that as well. So very accessible spots in that regard. You mentioned something about low vision. We do a great deal in classrooms for low vision. So two things that we're doing at the moment is looking at color and the way that color affects the way perception happens, for one thing. So, looking at different kinds of backgrounds and the lighting in spaces for people with low vision. But someone who's completely vision impaired, who might not be able to see anything at all, is often provided with accessibility spaces, so they have hearing platforms so that they can listen with greater intent without being concerned about the people near them. Braille texts are provided, audio books are provided. Most of our books nowadays are provided on audio. So, even if I'm speaking in a lecture, I have two recordings, one which is visual, so your face and things are captured, and there's another one which is audio. So there's a lot of capacity that's provided for that. But like someone said earlier, it does depend on the resources. Some of what's happening in Australia at the moment is on account of COVID. We didn't have that before. COVID changed things. So, when we were working from home, we didn't have too much access to the buildings and things like that. So people were forced to record and do stuff for students with disabilities that they didn't do before. And now that we've gone back and things are back to normal, we just kept doing it. We just continued doing what we were doing. So it created more accessibility. It's improved the experience considerably for a student with a disability. There's lots and lots of policy that's been placed in line with experiencing education differently. So we've got a disability support unit, which became very prominent during COVID and then became stronger after COVID finished. So there was that. And then also thinking about how students interact with one another, which is, I think, fundamental to good education, that you think about a student who has a disability and has no friends. So, if the student doesn't have friends, they're not going to be feeling like they are wanted in those spaces. So we have social units for students with disabilities so that they have peers who can support them. We actually call it that, PASS, the PASS system, Peer Assisted Support Service. So it belongs to that system. So the student with a disability actually has support from a peer. So quite a bit of stuff has been done already, but like I said, it intensified during COVID, and then now it's just regarded as common practice as well. I hope that helps.
Jawab. Teman-teman ada lagi yang baru datang mungkin hahong ini. Apa ya? Siapa tahu ada yang mau ditanyakan terkait dengan konteks pendidikan inklusi. Ada? Okay, let me conclude your materials in bahasa Indonesia. Jadi kalau mau ditarik kesimpulan apa yang disampaikan oleh Pearl tadi, intinya adalah pendidikan inklusi itu nggak cuma sekedar kita bikin kelas yang kemudian memasukkan siswa dengan disabilitas udah selesai, tapi bagaimana kemudian kita memaksimalkan partisipasi siswa tersebut dalam proses pembelajaran. Dan untuk dalam prosesnya kita harus melibatkan nggak cuma siswanya tapi juga lingkungan sekolah, masyarakat dan keluarga gitu ya. Nah, beberapa keterbatasan yang sering kali muncul dalam pelaksanaan pendidikan inklusi ini biasanya persiapan guru yang kurang, termasuk kesadaran guru terkait dengan konsep disabilitas dan pendidikan inklusi, kemudian kurikulum yang nggak fleksibel, metode asesmen yang kurang fleksibel, terus dana tadi disebut ya, funding itu kurang, jadi itu memang salah satu faktor yang mempengaruhi. Terus keterlibatan orang tua sebagai pengasuh dan juga masyarakat. Kemudian tadi ada beberapa strategi yang juga disampaikan untuk bisa kemudian melaksanakan dalam pendidikan inklusi ini, misalnya satu, remove barrier, jadi menghilangkan berbagai hambatan baik secara fisik, sosial dan juga instruksional, kemudian pengembangan dan pelatihan guru gitu ya, sehingga punya kompetensi yang memadai untuk ngajar di sekolah inklusi. Terus mengajak komunitas atau masyarakat, orang tua dan juga staf-staf khusus yang mungkin dibutuhkan untuk mendukung pendidikan inklusi, kemudian menggunakan teknologi asistif atau teknologi bantu dan mendorong peer support dari teman-teman yang ada di kelas gitu untuk menumbuhkan kesadaran terhadap teman mereka yang disabilitas. Okay, I think no more questions. We at the end of our today's session. So once again, thank you very much, Pearl, for sharing such a valuable insight with us today. Your expertise and perspective on inclusive education have provided us with a deeper understanding and plenty to think about. We truly appreciate the time and effort you put into making the session both informative and inspiring. Hopefully someday you can come to Malang.
Oh, for sure, for sure. For sure,
Okay.
for sure. I'll definitely visit for sure.
Okay, yeah. To our participant, our students, thank you as well for your active engagement and thoughtful questions. We hope you found this seminar beneficial and look forward to seeing you in future session someday maybe. Okay, good afternoon everyone and good evening, Pearl.
Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful day.
All the best. See you
Terima
then.
kasih semuanya.
Bye-bye.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Give applause please. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pearl. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Oke, ya. Dengan demikian kegiatan saya tutup. Terima kasih semuanya atas partisipasinya. Setelah selesai jangan lupa absen gitu ya. Dan bisa ambil konsumsi di depan. Terima kasih semuanya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.